Hello everyone, I am the Crime Teller, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video, and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from, and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. Case 1. In the quiet town of Wakefield, where the streets were lined with old brick houses and small local businesses, a case emerged that shook the community to its core. It was the year 2011, a time when the town, known for its peaceful atmosphere, was suddenly thrown into a nightmare that would leave an imprint on its history. At the center of this case was a man named Richard Halewood. He was a 43-year-old former truck driver, an unassuming figure who had lived most of his life in the town. To his neighbors, he was just another ordinary man, someone who kept to himself, occasionally exchanging nods with those who passed by his house. His background was simple, having worked in logistics for nearly 2 decades before an injury forced him into early retirement. After losing his job, Richard became reclusive, spending most of his days at home or taking solitary drives around the outskirts of Wakefield. But beneath this quiet exterior lay something far darker. Richard had a past that few knew about. Decades earlier, he had been involved in minor crimes, petty theft, fraud, and an alleged case of harassment that never went to trial due to lack of evidence. He had always managed to stay under the radar, avoiding trouble serious enough to land him in prison. However, what no one realized was that his quiet lifestyle was masking something far more sinister. The case that would expose Richard's true nature began in early spring, when a 14-year-old girl named Eleanor Brooks disappeared. Eleanor was a bright, well-liked teenager who came from a loving family. She had an ordinary routine: school, extracurricular activities, and spending time with friends. There was nothing unusual about her life until the evening she failed to return home. Her parents, worried but hoping for a misunderstanding, tried calling her phone repeatedly. When she didn't answer, concern turned into panic. At first, authorities treated the case as a possible runaway situation. But Eleanor had no history of skipping school, no recent arguments with her family, and no known reason to leave voluntarily. As hours turned into days, the police began treating her disappearance as something far more serious. It wasn't until surveillance footage was reviewed that the first clue surfaced. A camera from a petrol station captured a brief, grainy image of Eleanor near a parked van. The vehicle was old, painted a dull blue, with rust creeping along the edges. It was registered under Richard Halewood's name. Richard was brought in for questioning, but he remained calm. He denied any involvement, claiming he had been home all evening and that someone must have stolen his van. His lack of a solid alibi, however, raised suspicion. When officers obtained a search warrant for his home, what they found inside changed the case entirely. His house, from the outside, was unremarkable, modest, with a neatly kept garden. But stepping inside revealed a different world. The interior was dark, cluttered, and filled with old newspapers, discarded wrappers, and a strange assortment of locks and chains. The basement door, heavily reinforced, stood out immediately. Behind it, investigators discovered a small, soundproofed room. It was there that they found Eleanor. The girl, terrified but alive, was sitting in the corner, hands bound but otherwise unharmed. She had been missing for nearly 5 days, kept in a space barely large enough to move around. Her eyes, filled with exhaustion and fear, told the story of those days spent in captivity. Richard was arrested immediately, though he continued to deny any wrongdoing. He insisted that he had simply been keeping her safe, offering no further explanation. His behavior throughout the investigation was disturbing, at times detached, at other moments almost smug, as if he believed he could escape justice. As the case unfolded, more disturbing details surfaced. Richard had been stalking Eleanor for weeks, observing her routine, following her from school to home. His search history revealed articles about past kidnappings, survival tactics, and ways to avoid detection. It became evident that this was not an impulsive act. It had been carefully planned. The trial that followed was swift but harrowing. Eleanor's testimony, delivered with remarkable courage, painted a picture of the fear she had endured. She spoke of the hours spent in darkness, of the chilling quiet, of the way Richard spoke to her as if he believed they shared some kind of twisted connection. Richard Halewood was sentenced to life imprisonment, his name forever etched into Wakefield's history as a man who had shattered the town's sense of security. Eleanor, despite the trauma, showed incredible resilience. She eventually moved away, determined to leave the nightmare behind. For Wakefield, the scars of the case remained. It was a grim reminder that darkness could exist even in the most ordinary of places, lurking behind the most unassuming faces. And though justice was served, the town would never quite be the same again. The days following Richard Halewood's arrest were filled with shock and disbelief. The people of Wakefield, a town known for its calm and uneventful nature, struggled to grasp the horror that had unfolded in their own backyard. Neighbors who had once exchanged polite nods with Richard now found themselves questioning every interaction they had ever had with him. Could they have seen the signs? Was there something they had missed? In the immediate aftermath, investigators combed through every inch of Richard's home. What they found only deepened the mystery. Hidden among the clutter of old newspapers and discarded wrappers were notebooks. Hundreds of pages filled with scrawled observations, times, and locations. It became clear that Eleanor Brooks had not been his first target. There were detailed notes about other girls, some as young as 12, others closer to Eleanor's age. The descriptions were meticulous: where they walked after school, who they spoke to, what time they usually got home. Some names had been crossed out, though whether that meant they had been discarded as potential victims or if something else had happened to them remained unclear. But the most chilling discovery was a collection of old VHS tapes stored in a locked drawer. The tapes, dusty and seemingly untouched for years, held recordings of Richard himself, mumbling to the camera, talking about his purpose, his vision. He spoke in a slow, deliberate voice, often stopping mid-sentence as if lost in thought before continuing. In one tape, he described his collection, referring to the notebooks. He mentioned Eleanor by name long before she was taken. The tapes also revealed his disturbing justification for his actions. Richard did not see himself as a criminal. Instead, he spoke about his need to rescue certain individuals from what he called the dangers of the world. He believed he was protecting them, keeping them safe from a society that he viewed as corrupt and broken. His words were a blend of delusion and meticulous planning, making it clear that his mind had long been lost to a darkness few could understand. Meanwhile, Eleanor was undergoing her own battle. Though physically unharmed, the psychological wounds ran deep. She barely spoke in the days following her rescue, her once bright demeanor now replaced by an unsettling quiet. Her parents struggled to reach her, desperate to restore some sense of normalcy to their lives. But how does one return to normal after something like this? The media descended on Wakefield, turning the small town into a temporary epicenter of national attention. News channels broadcasted images of Richard's house, journalists interviewed horrified neighbors, and crime analysts debated his mental state on live television. The town, which had once been just another quiet place on the map, was now synonymous with one of the most disturbing cases in recent history. But while the world dissected every detail of the case, a new concern began to arise. Investigators, looking deeper into Richard's past, uncovered records of his movements over the last 10 years. He had traveled frequently, often staying in small motels or camping in rural areas. His bank statements showed purchases from hardware stores, chains, locks, heavy-duty plastic sheets. It was impossible to ignore the implication. Eleanor may not have been the only victim. Search efforts were expanded. Areas Richard had visited were scoured. Old missing person cases were re-examined. The deeper authorities dug, the more unsettling the picture became. One name kept appearing in the case files: Hannah Weller, a 16-year-old girl who had disappeared from a neighboring town 7 years earlier. At the time, her case had gone cold, assumed to be a runaway situation with no leads to follow. But Richard's notebooks contained her name, her school route, even rough sketches of her face. Unlike Eleanor's, Hannah's name was not crossed out. Authorities searched Richard's house for any physical evidence linking him to Hannah's disappearance, but there was nothing definitive. No remains, no belongings, no direct confession. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. But then, another discovery changed everything. An officer reviewing Richard's old travel logs noticed something strange. Frequent visits to a remote, abandoned farmhouse on the outskirts of Wakefield. It was a place he had no apparent reason to visit, a property left untouched for years. A team was sent to investigate. What they found sent shockwaves through the department. In the basement of the farmhouse, behind a decaying wooden door, lay a makeshift room eerily similar to the one where Eleanor had been kept. The walls were lined with old blankets, the air was stale, and on the floor, buried under layers of dust and debris, was a single silver necklace. It belonged to Hannah Weller. Her parents confirmed it immediately. The pendant, a small crescent moon, had been a gift for her 15th birthday. It was something she had never taken off. The discovery reignited the search for Hannah, but after so many years, the hope of finding her alive was slim. The farmhouse was examined from top to bottom, but no remains were found. Cadaver dogs were brought in, searching the surrounding fields, the forests nearby, the shallow stream that ran past the property. But still nothing. It was as if Richard had known they would come looking one day. And just like he had planned Eleanor's abduction down to the smallest detail, perhaps he had planned how to cover his tracks just as well. As the trial for Eleanor's kidnapping progressed, the prosecution painted Richard as a dangerous and calculating predator. His notebooks, his tapes, and his obsession with control all pointed to the mind of a man who had spent years perfecting his methods. The jury took little time to convict him. He was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole. But for Hannah's family, there was no closure. Even as Richard sat in his prison cell, refusing to speak of her whereabouts, the question lingered. What had happened to her? Was she still alive somewhere, locked away in another hidden place? Or had she met a fate too grim to imagine? The farmhouse remained a site of speculation, visited by amateur investigators and journalists hoping to uncover new evidence. But as time passed, the case faded from the public's mind, buried beneath newer headlines. Eleanor, after years of therapy and support, managed to rebuild some semblance of a life. She moved away, changed her name, and tried to leave the nightmare behind. But the scars, both seen and unseen, would never fully disappear. And in the quiet corners of Wakefield, in the places where Richard Halewood once lurked, an unease still lingered. Because if there was one thing this case had proven, it was that darkness could exist anywhere, hiding behind the most ordinary of faces. And some mysteries, no matter how hard one searches for answers, remain unsolved. The years passed, but the shadow of Richard Halewood's crimes never truly left Wakefield. His name was whispered in hushed tones, his house avoided by the locals even after it was boarded up and left to decay. The trial might have ended, the verdict delivered, but the scars he had left behind remained fresh, especially for the families affected by his crimes. Eleanor Brooks, the survivor of his last known kidnapping, struggled to find peace even after moving away. The nightmares haunted her, vivid flashes of the darkened room, the sound of Richard's deliberate footsteps, the quiet hum of the city just beyond the locked walls. Therapy helped, but the memories clung to her like an invisible chain. Some nights, she would wake up gasping for breath, convinced that he was still watching her, that he had somehow found a way out of his prison cell and was coming back to finish what he had started. But the greatest wound left behind was the mystery of Hannah Weller. 7 years had passed since her disappearance, and despite the discovery of her necklace in the abandoned farmhouse, no further traces of her were ever found. Search parties had combed the surrounding land for months, dredging rivers, digging up old wells, even using thermal imaging to scan for any disturbances in the soil. But there was nothing. No body, no belongings, no undeniable proof of her fate. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. Her parents, Robert and Mary Weller, refused to give up hope. They made public appeals year after year, their faces weary but determined. They clung to the possibility that she was still alive, that Richard had stashed her away somewhere, just as he had with Eleanor. But Richard refused to speak. During his early days in prison, journalists, investigators, even psychologists tried to extract information from him. Some believed he enjoyed the attention, smirking when pressed for details, feigning memory loss when asked about Hannah. Others thought he was simply playing a game, relishing in the control he still had, the power to withhold the one truth that everyone desperately sought. One detective, who had worked the case since the beginning, visited Richard in prison regularly, trying to break through the twisted logic of his mind. He tried reasoning with him, tried anger, tried sympathy. But Richard always gave the same infuriating response. Some things are better left undiscovered. And so, the years dragged on, and Hannah became just another name on the long list of missing persons in the UK. The public moved on, but her parents never did. Then, a decade after her disappearance, an unexpected breakthrough occurred. It started with a fire. A small team of urban explorers had ventured into the abandoned farmhouse where Hannah's necklace had been found, looking to document what remained of the place. It had become something of a local legend, a cursed house, a place that carried an unshakable sense of dread. They filmed their way through the decaying structure, speaking in hushed voices as they described the eerie silence, the untouched remnants of Richard's secret world. Then, one of them knocked over an old oil lantern that had been left behind. The fire spread rapidly, consuming the dry wood of the walls and sending thick plumes of smoke into the sky. By the time the fire department arrived, the structure had nearly collapsed. The explorers were unharmed, but the house, Richard's house of horrors, was reduced to nothing but smoldering ruins. And that was when they found it. Beneath the remains of the farmhouse, hidden under layers of earth and debris, firefighters uncovered what appeared to be an old root cellar, long forgotten and sealed away. The entrance had been concealed by what was once the kitchen floor, now burned through, revealing a dark, narrow tunnel leading deep underground. The discovery sent shockwaves through the investigation team. Forensic specialists were immediately called to the site, carefully documenting everything as they descended into the hidden chamber. What they found there sent a chill through even the most seasoned detectives. The room was small, no more than 10 feet across, with concrete walls that showed signs of crude modifications. Rusted chains hung from the ceiling, and in the corner, an old, moldy mattress lay on the floor. The air was thick with dust, but something else lingered in the atmosphere, a suffocating presence of the past, of suffering that could never be undone. And then they found the bones. The skeletal remains were curled up in the farthest corner of the room, partially buried under layers of dirt and old fabric. The forensic team worked with precision, carefully extracting each fragment. DNA tests would later confirm what everyone already knew. Hannah Weller had finally been found. The news devastated her parents. After so many years of hoping, of believing that she might still be out there somewhere, the finality of her fate was almost too much to bear. But at the same time, there was a grim sense of relief. The endless wondering, the sleepless nights, the constant question of whether she was still suffering, they were over. Richard Halewood, now old and frail, was confronted with the discovery. His reaction was as cold as ever. He simply smiled. "You had to burn the past to finally see the truth," he told the warden. No further explanation, no remorse, just a cryptic remark that only deepened the horror of it all. With Hannah's remains recovered, the case was finally considered closed. Richard would die in prison, his secrets buried with him. Wakefield would eventually heal, though the scars would remain in its history. The house where he once lived was gone, but the stories would persist, stories of a man who hid in plain sight, of a girl whose fate was sealed long before anyone knew to look for her, and of the darkness that can exist in the most ordinary of places, waiting, watching, choosing its next moment to surface. For Eleanor Brooks, Hannah's discovery was a haunting reminder of how close she had come to sharing the same fate. She spent years rebuilding her life, refusing to let Richard's actions define her. But on some nights, when sleep evaded her and the echoes of the past crept into her thoughts, she found herself wondering the same thing over and over. How many others had there been? Had Richard told the truth when he said some things were better left undiscovered? Or was there more beneath the surface, waiting to be found? The farmhouse was gone, but the land remained. And somewhere beneath the soil, buried in forgotten corners of Wakefield, the past might still be waiting to be unearthed. Case 2. The air in Houston, Texas, was thick with humidity that late summer evening in 2011. The streets were alive with the usual bustle of city life. People heading home from work, neon signs flickering above convenience stores, and distant car horns blaring in the background. But in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of the city, something far more sinister was unfolding behind closed doors. At the center of this story was Dwayne Callister, a man whose name had never been associated with crime before. At 47 years old, he was known as an unassuming mechanic working at a local auto repair shop. To his neighbors, he was polite but distant, often seen tinkering in his garage or mowing his lawn in the blistering Texas heat. He lived alone in a modest single-story house, surrounded by a fence that seemed unnecessarily high for a man with no family. But beneath his quiet demeanor was a deeply disturbed individual. Dwayne had always been a loner, harboring unspoken frustrations with the world. He had a history of failed relationships, mostly due to his controlling nature and unpredictable temper. Those who had worked with him described him as meticulous, perhaps even obsessive about details, but no one had ever suspected the darkness that lurked within him. On the evening of August 14, 2011, a 14-year-old girl named Emily Prescott disappeared from her suburban neighborhood just a few miles from where Dwayne lived. Emily had last been seen riding her bicycle home from a friend's house, a route she had taken dozens of times before. It was a well-lit street, lined with houses, and only a 15-minute ride. But that night, she never made it home. Her parents, James and Linda Prescott, knew something was wrong almost immediately. Emily was a responsible teenager, always checking in when she arrived somewhere. When she failed to come home, her mother called her cell phone repeatedly, each call going straight to voicemail. Within an hour, James was driving the route she should have taken, his headlights scanning the sidewalks for any sign of his daughter. But there was nothing, no bicycle, no school bag, not even a discarded phone. By midnight, a missing persons report had been filed. Local law enforcement took the case seriously from the start, knowing that every passing hour lessened the chance of a safe recovery. Investigators scoured security footage from nearby stores and gas stations, hoping for any lead. What they found was chilling. At 8:37 p.m., a grainy surveillance camera outside a liquor store captured Emily riding past. Less than 2 minutes later, another camera from a residential street showed a dark-colored pickup truck idling at a stop sign. Emily's bike was visible in the distance, her figure small under the dim glow of a streetlight. Moments later, the truck pulled forward, its brake lights flashing before disappearing into the night. Emily Prescott had vanished, and that truck, it was later identified as belonging to Dwayne Callister. What no one knew at the time was that Emily was trapped in a nightmare beyond comprehension. Inside Dwayne's house, behind that tall wooden fence, an underground basement lay hidden beneath the garage, an unregistered addition to the property that not even city inspectors were aware of. And in that suffocating space, Emily Prescott was locked away, cut off from the world above. Dwayne had spent years planning for something like this. He had built the basement himself, pouring concrete and installing soundproof insulation to ensure that no screams could escape. It was small, barely large enough to stand upright, with a single mattress on the floor and a locked steel door. A single light bulb flickered dimly from the ceiling, casting eerie shadows on the cold walls. Emily's parents had no way of knowing that their daughter was being held just a few miles from their home, her captor living his life as if nothing had changed. He went to work the next day, repaired cars, had lunch at his usual diner, and even exchanged small talk with his neighbors. But beneath the surface, the reality of what he had done was beginning to unravel. The abduction had been planned, but now that Emily was in his grasp, Dwayne was facing something he had not anticipated: panic. The media coverage was relentless, her face plastered across news stations and missing person posters. Police set up roadblocks, questioned witnesses, and urged anyone with information to come forward. Dwayne knew he couldn't keep her forever, but he also knew that letting her go was not an option. The walls of the hidden basement seemed to close in on Emily as the hours turned into days. The air was stale, carrying a faint scent of damp concrete and old dust. A dim yellow bulb flickered overhead, its weak glow the only source of light in the confined space. She had screamed on the first night, pounding on the steel door until her hands were raw, but no one had come. No one had heard her. Above ground, Dwayne Callister carried on as if nothing had changed. He woke up at dawn, brewed his usual black coffee, and drove to work in the same truck that had swallowed Emily whole. He was meticulous in keeping his routine, knowing that any deviation could raise suspicion. He fixed carburetors, rotated tires, and even managed a chuckle or two with his co-workers. But inside his mind, chaos festered. Every time he glanced at the newspaper stands or turned on the news, Emily's face was there, smiling in a school portrait, her brown eyes bright and full of life. Reporters covered the story endlessly, their voices laced with urgency. 14-year-old Emily Prescott, last seen near Sycamore Street, has been missing for over 72 hours. Law enforcement is urging anyone with information to step forward. Dwayne felt his skin prickle with sweat. The walls were closing in, just like the ones in his basement. At night, when the city quieted, he would descend the creaky wooden stairs leading to the garage, lift the trapdoor, and step into the suffocating darkness below. Emily had stopped screaming by then. She knew it was useless. She had learned that the man who took her wasn't moved by her tears. Instead, she stared at him with hollow eyes, her body curled against the farthest corner of the small, claustrophobic room. Dwayne would bring her food, cold sandwiches, bottled water, sometimes a bruised apple. He never spoke much, and when he did, his words were stiff and mechanical, as if he were reading from a script in his head. He had told himself that this was what he had always wanted, that he was finally in control. But the reality was messier than the fantasy. Emily wasn't just an object. She wasn't some lifeless thing he could stash away and forget about. She was real. She had a voice, even when she didn't use it. And that scared him. Meanwhile, the Prescott family was unraveling. Emily's mother, Linda, hadn't slept in days. Her face was gaunt, her eyes hollow. James Prescott, a man known for his steady composure, had become a shell of himself. He spent his days driving aimlessly, searching for any trace of his daughter, questioning strangers on the street. Police had set up a command center near their neighborhood, collecting tips, but nothing led anywhere. It was as if Emily had simply ceased to exist. The community rallied behind them, organizing search parties that combed through wooded areas, abandoned buildings, and drainage ditches. Volunteers held vigils, lighting candles and whispering prayers into the night. But the days kept passing, and with each sunset, hope withered. Then came the break in the case, the moment Dwayne Callister's carefully constructed world began to crack. It started with an observant gas station clerk. 5 days after Emily's disappearance, a young woman named Rachel Simmons was working the night shift when she noticed something strange. A man had entered the store around midnight, purchasing bottled water, bread, and a handful of granola bars. That wasn't odd in itself. People bought groceries at all hours. But there was something off about him. He seemed tense, glancing around the store as if expecting someone to be watching. Rachel remembered the missing girl from the news. Something about the way the man carried himself made her uneasy. She didn't say anything at the time, but after he left, she checked the security footage. Her stomach twisted. The man had been driving a dark-colored pickup truck. The next morning, she reported it to the police. Detectives were already drowning in a sea of dead-end leads, but something about this one stood out. A surveillance image from the liquor store the night of the abduction showed a vehicle that matched the description of the one Rachel had reported. Investigators zoomed in, enhancing the grainy footage. A partial license plate was visible. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Within hours, authorities were knocking on Dwayne Callister's door. He answered casually, his expression neutral, as if this were just another mundane moment in his day. The officers asked him about his whereabouts the night Emily went missing. Dwayne played his part well, feigning confusion, then mild concern. But when they asked to see his truck, a flicker of tension crossed his face. Still, he knew better than to refuse. The truck was old, covered in a thin layer of dust from the Texas roads. It looked ordinary at first glance. But police weren't looking for the obvious. They combed through the vehicle meticulously, their gloved hands tracing over every surface. Then they found it. Long strands of light brown hair, tangled in the fibers of the passenger seat. Dwayne felt his breath hitch, his carefully built composure beginning to slip. He tried to explain it away, saying he had given a ride to a stranded motorist. But the detectives weren't convinced. They seized the truck for further analysis. Inside the house, officers searched every room, checking closets, peering under furniture. The place was eerily clean, almost too clean. But something felt off. Then, in the garage, an officer noticed a peculiar set of scuff marks near the tool bench. He knelt down, running his fingers over the wooden floor. It was subtle, but the boards didn't sit flush with the rest of the flooring. A hidden compartment. The officer called for backup. Within minutes, a crowbar was wedged into the seam, prying the boards apart. Then came the sickening moment of realization. A metal trapdoor, locked from the outside. Every officer in that garage knew what they would find before they even opened it. Their hands shook as they twisted the latch, lifting the heavy door. The stench of damp air rose to meet them, and there, curled in the darkness below, was Emily Prescott. She was alive. The news spread like wildfire. Within hours, reporters were camped outside Dwayne's house, cameras flashing as officers led him away in handcuffs. The community that had spent days searching, praying, hoping, now had their answer. Emily was rushed to the hospital, her frail body wrapped in a blanket, her eyes wide with shock. The doctors said she was dehydrated but stable. Her parents collapsed in relief the moment they saw her. Dwayne Callister was charged with multiple felonies, including kidnapping and unlawful confinement. His quiet life, his carefully maintained illusion of normalcy, had been shattered beyond repair. And yet, even as he sat in an interrogation room, hands cuffed, the weight of his crimes sinking in, he remained silent. But his silence no longer mattered. Emily was safe, and the nightmare was finally over. The days that followed Emily's rescue were a blur of flashing cameras, whispered prayers, and the endless hum of voices, doctors, detectives, reporters, and loved ones. The world around her had changed, yet inside, she felt frozen in time, trapped in the small, suffocating basement where she had spent nearly a week of her life. Her parents barely left her side. Linda held her hand constantly, afraid that if she let go, Emily might vanish again. James, a man who had always been the rock of the family, now found himself breaking down at the smallest things. A familiar song playing on the radio, the sight of Emily's untouched breakfast plate, the sound of her breathing at night. She was home. She was safe. But safety didn't mean the nightmare was over. For Emily, sleep became her enemy. Every time she closed her eyes, she was back in that cold, windowless room, the dim light flickering, the sound of distant footsteps above sending chills down her spine. She could still feel the scratchy blanket wrapped around her, still hear the creak of the trapdoor being lifted. Sometimes she woke up screaming, her body drenched in sweat, her heart racing so fast she thought it might stop. The therapists called it PTSD. They said it was normal, that healing would take time. But to Emily, time felt like an illusion. Days stretched endlessly, yet the night swallowed her whole, dragging her back to a place she desperately wanted to escape. Meanwhile, the world outside was consumed with the trial of Dwayne Callister. The town of Bastrop, Texas, once a quiet, forgotten corner of the state, had now become the center of national attention. News vans lined the streets. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse, holding signs demanding justice. People who had never met Emily spoke of her, as if they had known her all their lives. But the one person who refused to speak was Dwayne himself. From the moment of his arrest, he had remained silent. No confessions, no apologies. His lawyers had attempted to argue that he was mentally unwell, that his actions were the result of an unstable mind. But the evidence painted a different picture. A man who had meticulously planned every detail, from the abduction to the basement prison he had built beneath his home. The prosecution spared no mercy. They laid out everything before the jury. Photos of the hidden room, forensic reports matching Emily's hair and fingerprints inside the truck, testimonies from neighbors who recalled seeing Dwayne's vehicle near the school on the day she disappeared. And then came the moment everyone had been waiting for, Emily's testimony. She had spent days preparing, rehearsing with her lawyer, trying to steel herself for what was to come. But nothing could have prepared her for the weight of that courtroom, the suffocating air thick with judgment and anticipation. She sat in the witness stand, her hands gripping the wooden railing so tightly her knuckles turned white. The moment her eyes met Dwayne's across the room, her body locked up. He was different now, no longer the looming figure in the basement, but a caged animal, his orange jumpsuit a stark contrast to the man who had once walked freely among them. The courtroom was silent as Emily spoke. She recounted everything, not just the abduction, but the fear, the hopelessness, the nights spent staring at the ceiling, wondering if she would ever see her family again. She described the way he had brought her food without emotion, the way he had watched her without speaking, as if she were some possession he had acquired rather than a human being. Somewhere in the crowd, Linda Prescott wept into her hands. James sat stone-faced, gripping his wife's shoulder, his eyes never leaving the man who had taken their daughter. When the defense tried to cross-examine Emily, suggesting that maybe Dwayne had meant no harm, that perhaps he had been lonely and misguided, the prosecutor cut them off swiftly. Kidnapping is not an act of loneliness. Locking a child in a basement is not a mistake. It is a crime, and we are here today to make sure that crime does not go unpunished. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. Guilty, on all counts. Dwayne Callister was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. There would be no second chances, no appeals. The world outside would move on without him, just as he had once tried to remove Emily from hers. But justice, though delivered, did not erase the scars. Emily tried to return to normal. She went back to school, though the whispers followed her down the hallways. Teachers treated her gently, as if afraid she might shatter. Friends who had once gossiped with her now stumbled over their words, unsure of what to say. She started therapy, learning how to navigate the memories that refused to let go. She kept a journal, writing down the nightmares when they came, pouring them onto paper so they wouldn't consume her. And little by little, she found her way back. She joined a local self-defense class, not because she wanted to fight, but because she never wanted to feel powerless again. She spoke at community events, raising awareness about missing children, about the importance of being aware, of fighting for those who had no voice. Years passed, and Emily grew. The girl who had once been locked away in a dark basement became a woman who refused to let the darkness define her. She graduated high school with honors. She went to college, studying psychology, determined to help others who had faced the same demons she had. And though the memories would always be there, lingering in the corners of her mind, she refused to let them win. Because Emily Prescott was not just a victim, she was a survivor. Case 3. In the quiet town of Enid, Oklahoma, a place where everyone seemed to know each other's name, a man named Daniel Danny Whitaker lived a life that, on the surface, appeared completely ordinary. A 42-year-old mechanic, Danny had spent years fixing cars at the local auto shop, earning the trust of his customers and the casual respect of his neighbors. He was neither overly friendly nor particularly reserved, just another face in a town of 50,000 people. But beneath the veneer of normalcy, Danny harbored a darkness that no one saw. His childhood had been troubled, marked by a father who drank too much and a mother who had disappeared when he was 10. He grew up shifting from one foster home to another, learning quickly that the world was unkind to those without roots. By his late teens, he had run-ins with the law, petty theft, trespassing, disorderly conduct. Yet, nothing in his past hinted at what he would become. It was in the summer of 2009 when Danny Whitaker crossed a line that would forever stain his name in the town's history. The victim was a 14-year-old girl named Sarah Monroe, an ordinary teenager with dreams of becoming a journalist. She had a loving family, a circle of close friends, and a tendency to spend her afternoons at the local library, lost in books about faraway places. The day she vanished, it had been unbearably hot. Oklahoma summers had a way of making the air thick and suffocating, and that afternoon, Sarah had chosen to walk home from the library rather than wait for her mother to pick her up. It was only a short distance, maybe 20 minutes on foot, down roads she had walked 100 times before. She never made it home. Her disappearance sent shockwaves through the community. At first, no one wanted to believe the worst. Maybe she had gone to a friend's house. Maybe she had taken a different route and lost track of time. But as the hours stretched into a day, then too panic set in. Flyers were printed, search parties were formed, and the Monroe family pleaded on television for their daughter's safe return. Behind the scenes, investigators were working tirelessly. They combed through security footage from nearby businesses, interviewed anyone who might have seen Sarah that day, and followed every lead, no matter how small. That was when they found the first clue, a grainy image from a gas station camera showing Sarah walking past, just minutes before she vanished. And behind her, not far in the distance, was an old rusted pickup truck. It took days to track down the owner of the truck. The plate was partially obscured, but with some digital enhancements, investigators traced it back to a name, Daniel Whitaker. The first time police questioned Danny, he was calm. He admitted that, yes, he had been in the area, but no, he hadn't seen Sarah Monroe that day. He had been running errands, picking up parts for a repair job, minding his own business. It was a small town, after all. Seeing a truck near a missing girl didn't mean anything. There was no evidence, nothing to tie him to the crime. And for a while, it seemed like the case might go cold. But then, on the fourth day of Sarah's disappearance, everything changed. A woman named Cheryl Anderson, a single mother who lived in a rundown trailer park on the outskirts of town, called the police with a tip. She worked nights as a waitress at a roadside diner, and she swore that on the night Sarah disappeared, she had seen Danny's truck parked behind an abandoned barn about 10 miles out of town. "I remember because I thought it was weird," she told the dispatcher. "Ain't nothing out there but empty land. And I swear I heard something, a sound like a girl crying. But I figured maybe it was just an animal or something. Investigators took the lead seriously. The next morning, a convoy of police vehicles made their way to the barn, hidden among overgrown fields and forgotten dirt roads. The structure itself was barely standing, its wooden beams cracked and splintered, the roof sagging in the middle. From the outside, it looked empty, but inside, past broken boards and scattered debris, they found her. Sarah Monroe was alive. Sarah Monroe was found in the darkest corner of the barn, her small frame curled up against the rotting wooden wall. Her clothes were torn and dirty, her skin bruised, but when the officers called her name, she lifted her head. The moment her terrified eyes met theirs, she burst into silent sobs. She was too weak to stand on her own, but as soon as the officers reached her, she clung to them as if she were afraid they might disappear. The barn smelled of damp earth, rust, and something else, something sickly sweet and foul. There was a dirty mattress on the floor, an old camping lantern flickering weakly, and a rope lying discarded nearby. The sight of it made the officers' stomachs churn. It didn't take long to confirm what they already suspected. Sarah Monroe had been kept here for days. As they carried her out into the sunlight, she blinked against the brightness, her fragile body trembling in their arms. The first words she managed to whisper were barely audible. "He said no one would ever find me." The officers exchanged grim looks. Whoever had done this had planned for her to stay here indefinitely. If they had been even a day later, the outcome might have been much different. Meanwhile, back in Enid, the search for Daniel Whitaker had begun. The moment authorities confirmed Sarah's rescue, his house was swarmed by law enforcement. But Danny was nowhere to be found. His truck was parked in the driveway, the keys still in the ignition, as if he had abandoned it in a hurry. Inside, the house was eerily silent. The furniture was sparse, the rooms nearly bare, as if he had never truly made it a home. A more thorough search revealed disturbing discoveries. Hidden in the bottom drawer of his bedroom dresser were newspaper clippings of other missing girls, cases from years past, some solved, others not. Some of the girls had been found alive, others had simply vanished without a trace. None of them were from Enid, but they were all young, all eerily similar to Sarah. And then in the kitchen, they found something even worse. A notebook. Its pages were filled with frantic, disjointed writing. Thoughts, plans, confessions written in a hand that became more erratic the further one read. It wasn't just a record of Sarah's kidnapping. It was a history of a man who had been on the edge of darkness for years. He wrote about his urges, his struggles to suppress them, his failures. He described past encounters with girls he had watched, some he had followed but never taken. And worst of all, he wrote about what he planned to do next. They needed to find him. Sarah Monroe's testimony was crucial. Though she was traumatized, detectives worked carefully to get as much information as they could. She described how Danny had pulled up beside her in his truck, offering her a ride home. When she declined, he had simply driven ahead and parked on the side of the road. By the time she realized what was happening, he was behind her, a rag pressed to her face, the world spinning into darkness before she could scream. She had woken up in the barn, tied at the wrists and ankles, her mouth dry, her head pounding. He had come and gone, bringing her food and water but speaking very little. The only words he ever said were warnings. No one would find her, no one would hear her, and if she tried to escape, there would be consequences. Sarah had no doubt that he meant every word. While she was being treated at the hospital, authorities expanded their search for Danny Whitaker. He had no close friends, no family in the area, and no known places he might run to. But then a tip came in from a truck stop an hour outside of town. A clerk had seen a man matching Danny's description, dirty and disheveled, paying for gas in cash. He had asked if the station sold burner phones. By the time officers arrived, he was already gone. For the next 48 hours, the manhunt intensified. Danny's face was on every news channel, his description broadcasted over the radio. Roadblocks were set up, highways were patrolled, and still he remained just out of reach. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. Until someone spotted smoke. In a heavily wooded area near the Kansas border, a park ranger reported seeing an abandoned car deep in the forest. Next to it, a small fire was burning, the smoke rising in a thin gray column. Law enforcement moved in carefully, rifles raised, their boots crunching over dead leaves and twigs. And there he was. Danny Whitaker sat on the ground, his back against a tree, staring blankly at the flames in front of him. He made no move to run, no attempt to fight. When officers approached, he simply lifted his hands, as if he had already accepted his fate. The last words he spoke before they took him into custody were chilling in their simplicity. "I wasn't finished." Back in Enid, the town breathed a sigh of relief. Parents held their children a little closer that night. Strangers were a little less trusted. And Sarah Monroe, though she would never be the same, was home. But the damage had been done. And deep in the evidence locker of the Enid Police Department, Danny Whitaker's notebook sat, filled with questions that no one wanted to answer. The trial of Daniel Whitaker became one of the most followed cases in Oklahoma's recent history. His capture had brought temporary relief to the town of Enid, but as details of his crimes emerged, that relief was replaced with horror. Investigators dug deeper into his past, trying to understand what had driven him to commit such an act. What they uncovered was far worse than they had imagined. Daniel Whitaker wasn't just a man who had kidnapped Sarah Monroe. He was a man who had spent years perfecting his ability to blend in, to move undetected. His job as a handyman had allowed him access to homes across multiple towns, and his quiet, forgettable demeanor meant that no one ever looked twice at him. But the evidence found in his home suggested that Sarah hadn't been his first victim. Inside a locked drawer in his garage, police discovered dozens of old VHS tapes and USB drives. The contents of these recordings were never made public, but what the investigators saw confirmed their worst fears. The tapes dated back more than a decade. Some showed women and girls being followed from a distance, unaware that they were being watched. Others depicted unknown victims in rooms similar to the barn where Sarah had been found. There was no sound, only grainy footage of people trapped, waiting, terrified. Some of them had been found alive. Others had never been found at all. As authorities worked to identify the individuals in the recordings, prosecutors prepared to take Danny to trial. Sarah Monroe, still recovering from the trauma of her captivity, became the key witness. Though she was strong, testifying against him took everything she had. She described in painful detail the moment he had taken her, the hours she had spent locked away in the barn, and the fear that had never left her. Throughout the proceedings, Danny remained eerily silent. He showed no emotion when Sarah spoke, no remorse when the prosecution listed the charges against him. He sat there, his face blank, as if he were simply an observer to his own downfall. The only time he reacted was when the recordings were played in court. For the first time, he looked uncomfortable, his fingers twitching, his jaw tightening. But he said nothing. Then came the most damning piece of evidence, his notebook. The prosecution read passages aloud, detailing his thoughts leading up to Sarah's abduction. He had written about the thrill of taking someone, the careful planning, the satisfaction of control. He had written about others he had considered taking, girls he had followed but never approached. The notes were chilling, methodical, and undeniable proof of his intentions. The jury only deliberated for 3 hours. Guilty, on all counts. Danny Whitaker was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. There would be no chance of him walking free again, no opportunity for him to harm anyone else. But for the people of Enid, and especially for Sarah Monroe, the scars remained. Years later, Sarah would go on to speak publicly about her experience. She became an advocate for victims of abduction and trauma, using her story to help others find their voice. Though the nightmares never fully left her, she refused to let them define her. As for Danny Whitaker, he remained a ghost in the prison system. He rarely spoke, never participated in interviews, and never provided answers about the fates of his other victims. His name slowly faded from headlines, his story buried beneath the weight of new crimes, new tragedies. But in the quiet corners of Enid, people still whispered about him. The handyman who had walked among them unnoticed. The man who had watched, waited, and taken. The predator who had finally been caught. And somewhere, in the locked archives of the Enid Police Department, his notebook remained, a grim reminder that monsters do exist. And sometimes they live right next door. Case 4. The summer of 1997 in Melbourne, Australia, had an uneasy tension in the air. The crime rate had been on the rise, but few expected that a single night would spiral into one of the most chilling incidents in the city's history. At the center of it all was a man named Danny Whitmore, a name that would later be remembered with both fear and regret. Danny was 34 years old, a man with a face that could blend into a crowd, making him invisible when he wanted to be. He had short, sandy brown hair, deep-set blue eyes, and a lean frame that had once belonged to an athlete, but now showed the wear of a troubled life. He had grown up in the rough suburbs of Melbourne, where crime was not just a way to survive, it was a way of life. His record was long but filled with mostly petty offenses, theft, burglary, fraud. He had served time but always managed to slip through the cracks of the justice system, avoiding anything long-term. Yet, something changed in Danny that year. He had grown impatient with small-time crime. The thrill of stealing jewelry or breaking into houses was no longer enough. He wanted more money, more risk, more control. And that desire would lead him to a night of irreversible consequences. It began with a plan. Danny, along with 2 accomplices, Ryan Brooks, a hot-headed 29-year-old with a violent past, and Stephen Carter, a 41-year-old ex-security guard turned criminal, decided that they would target an armored cash transport van. It was meant to be simple. Intercept the vehicle as it made a routine stop at a shopping center, overpower the guards, take the money, and disappear before the police could react. But plans rarely unfold as intended. The heist was set for a late Thursday evening in early December, just before Christmas, when cash deposits were high. The trio had spent weeks studying the schedule of the transport van, mapping out exit routes, and gathering the necessary weapons, illegally obtained pistols, and a sawed-off shotgun. Danny had insisted that violence was only a last resort, but Ryan, the most volatile of the group, had laughed at the notion. He didn't believe in leaving witnesses. The day of the robbery was sweltering. Melbourne's heat clung to the asphalt, making the air heavy and the city restless. Danny, Ryan, and Stephen sat in a stolen sedan in the underground parking lot of the shopping center, waiting for their moment. The armored van arrived right on time, just as expected. 2 guards stepped out, one keeping watch while the other carried bags of cash into the bank. It was the opening they needed. Danny took a deep breath and nodded to the others. The doors of the sedan opened silently, and the three men moved swiftly. Ryan was the first to act, too soon, too reckless. He raised his pistol and fired a warning shot before the guards had even seen them coming. Panic erupted. The standing guard reached for his weapon, but Ryan was faster. Another shot rang out, and the guard crumpled to the ground. Danny froze for a moment. This wasn't how it was supposed to happen. Stephen, the most composed of the group, rushed forward, grabbing the cash bags from the second guard, who had abandoned them in terror. People in the shopping center screamed and ducked behind cars, their voices echoing through the parking lot. The heist had turned into chaos, and the situation was spiraling out of control. What was meant to be a quick, clean robbery had become something much worse. And in that moment, Danny knew, this was no longer just theft. It was murder, and the consequences would be far worse than any crime he had ever committed before. Danny's heart pounded in his chest as the echoes of the gunshots still rang through the underground parking lot. The air smelled of burnt gunpowder and hot asphalt. This was not how it was supposed to go. The plan had been simple: get in, take the money, get out. No casualties. But Ryan had turned it into something far worse. For a brief moment, time seemed to stand still. The injured security guard lay motionless, his blood pooling beneath him, staining the pavement in dark crimson. The second guard, though terrified, had managed to dive behind a nearby vehicle, fumbling for his radio to call for help. Danny felt the weight of the situation crash over him. They had planned for contingencies, police response times, escape routes, alternative exits, but they had never planned for murder. And now, everything was about to unravel. Ryan was grinning, the pistol still clutched tightly in his hand. The adrenaline had taken over him. He thrived in this chaos, in this madness. Stephen, the supposed voice of reason in their crew, looked pale but kept moving. He hauled the bags of cash toward the getaway car, his hands shaking. Danny had a choice to make. They could flee, take the money, and hope they could disappear before the authorities swarmed the area. Or they could try to salvage what little control they had left over the situation. But there was no time for decisions. The distant wail of sirens reached his ears. Someone had already called the police. Maybe it was a bystander, or maybe the second guard had managed to radio for help. Either way, they had minutes, if that, before the parking lot would be flooded with law enforcement. Danny snapped into action. "Move, move," he growled, yanking open the door to the sedan. Ryan didn't need to be told twice. He bolted toward the car, while Stephen, still clutching the bags, slid into the back seat. Danny took the driver's seat, his hands trembling as he turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, just as flashing red and blue lights appeared at the entrance to the parking lot. "Hold on!" Danny shouted as he slammed the accelerator. The tires screeched against the concrete as the sedan shot forward, weaving past panicked shoppers and abandoned carts. A police cruiser skidded into the lot, blocking the main exit. An officer stepped out, gun drawn, shouting commands Danny couldn't hear over the pounding in his head. No choice. They had to ram through. He pressed harder on the pedal, aiming straight for the police car. At the last second, he swerved, clipping the rear bumper of the cruiser as they sped past. The force of the impact sent the stolen sedan fishtailing, but Danny gritted his teeth and kept control. Behind them, more sirens blared. The police were mobilizing fast. Helicopters would be in the air soon. Every roadblock in the city would be set up within minutes. They had to get out of Melbourne fast. Ryan was still laughing in the passenger seat, shaking with excitement. "Did you see that?" he shouted. "We're legends, man. We." Danny snapped. "Shut up!" His voice came out raw, furious. "You just shot a cop. This isn't some movie, Ryan. We're screwed." Ryan sneered but said nothing. He didn't care. He never did. Stephen, breathing heavily in the back seat, spoke up. "We need a plan. We can't just drive forever." Danny knew he was right. They had to ditch the car, get rid of the evidence. They had another vehicle stashed outside the city, a dusty old pickup hidden in a friend's abandoned shed. If they could get there without getting caught, they had a chance of slipping away before the police locked down every exit out of Melbourne. But luck wasn't on their side. Up ahead, a roadblock was already being set up. Cops were stepping out of their vehicles, shotguns and pistols at the ready. They weren't playing around anymore. The moment Danny saw the rifles being raised, he knew they had only one chance. He spun the wheel hard, taking a sharp right onto a smaller street, nearly clipping a street lamp. The stolen sedan's tires screeched, struggling to maintain grip. Ryan cursed as he was thrown against the dashboard. "Where are you going?" Stephen demanded. The docks, Danny growled. We ditch the car, we find another way out. The Port of Melbourne was a sprawling industrial zone filled with shipping containers, warehouses, and enough hiding spots to buy them some time. If they could just make it there, they might have a shot at escaping. The police were still on their tail, but Danny was driving like a man possessed. He took sharp turns, ran red lights, swerved through oncoming traffic, anything to break the line of sight. He could feel the sweat dripping down his neck, but he couldn't stop. Not yet. Finally, the docks loomed ahead. The smell of salt and oil filled the air as they sped past rows of shipping yards and heavy machinery. Danny slammed the brakes near an empty loading bay. Out, he barked. The three men scrambled out of the car. Danny wiped his prints from the steering wheel before shoving the door shut. It wouldn't be enough, but it would slow the cops down. Ryan looked around, eyes wild. Now what? Danny scanned the area. There had to be another way out. A boat. A truck. Something. Then in the distance he saw it. A cargo ship, its deck lit up against the darkening sky. Workers were moving crates, loading supplies. It was a long shot, but if they could stow away on that ship before the police arrived, they might just have a chance. The sound of approaching sirens snapped Danny back to reality. They had to move. Now. Danny's breath was ragged as he ran, his boots slamming against the pavement of the dock. The cold, salty air burned his lungs, but he didn't slow down. Neither did Stephen, whose grip on the bags of stolen cash was tight, his knuckles white. Ryan, always the reckless one, sprinted ahead, his blood still boiling from the high of the heist. Behind them, the sirens were growing louder. Police vehicles screeched to a halt at the edge of the port, their flashing lights bouncing off the metal shipping containers that lined the harbor. The officers were pouring out, weapons drawn, shouting commands that Danny had long since tuned out. There was no turning back. The cargo ship loomed before them, massive and hulking, its hull painted in chipped layers of navy blue and rust. Workers in reflective vests moved in an uncoordinated dance of heavy machinery and shouted orders, completely unaware of the chaos unfolding just beyond the perimeter. It was their last chance. Danny locked eyes with Stephen. The ship, he mouthed. Stephen nodded, shifting the weight of the money on his shoulder. Ryan, already ahead, didn't wait for permission. He vaulted over a stack of wooden crates, barely missing a dock worker who cursed at him in confusion. Danny and Stephen followed, weaving through the maze of containers and forklifts, their bodies pressed low to avoid being seen. Gunshots rang out. Danny flinched, ducking behind a steel cargo container. The police were shooting. Warning shots, maybe, but they were closing in fast. His heart pounded in his chest as he risked a glance over the edge. A group of officers had taken position near their abandoned getaway car, scanning the dockyard with flashlights and sidearms. "We need to get on that ship now," Stephen hissed, his voice tight with panic. Danny exhaled sharply. "Stay low. Move fast." They bolted from cover, slipping through the shadows cast by the towering stacks of metal crates. The gangway leading up to the cargo ship was only a few meters ahead, guarded by a lone dock worker who was too busy checking his clipboard to notice them. Ryan didn't hesitate. He charged forward, grabbed the man by the collar, and shoved him aside. The worker yelped in surprise, tumbling into a stack of loose netting as the three fugitives stormed up the gangway. The deck was a maze of shipping containers and industrial equipment. The smell of fuel and salt water filled the air. Crew members moved about in the dim light, their faces weary from a long night of work. They had to find a place to hide. Danny's mind raced. They couldn't stay out in the open. If the police caught wind that they were on the ship, it would be over. Ryan was already moving, scanning the deck like a predator looking for prey. Then he spotted it, a half-open storage hatch leading into the depths of the ship. Without waiting for confirmation, he slipped inside. Stephen followed, still clutching the money, and Danny brought up the rear, pulling the hatch shut behind them. Darkness swallowed them whole. The air was thick with the scent of rust and damp steel. Pipes lined the walls, dripping condensation onto the grated floor below. The hum of the ship's massive engines vibrated through their bones. They had made it. For now. Danny exhaled slowly, resting his head against the cold metal wall. His body ached from the chase, but his mind was racing. They weren't safe yet. The ship wouldn't stay in port forever, and the second the police figured out where they were, the entire operation would shut down. Stephen set the bags of money down carefully, his hands still shaking. Now what? Danny didn't have an answer. Ryan, ever the reckless optimist, grinned in the darkness. "We ride it out," he said. "Let it take us wherever it's going. By the time they figure it out, will be in international waters. It was a gamble, a dangerous one, but at this point, they had no other choice. Danny sat back against the wall, listening to the distant sounds of the crew above, the engines rumbling beneath them. He had made 1,000 wrong choices in his life. Maybe this was just another. Or maybe, just maybe, it was their only way out. Case 5. In the heart of Tegucigalpa, Honduras, a city where centuries-old colonial architecture mingled with the modern pulse of daily life and the dense tropical heat often pressed upon every street, a dark chapter was about to unfold in the summer of 2014. The city, known for its vibrant markets, intricate alleyways, and a resilient people who had weathered countless storms, had seldom witnessed a crime that would send ripples through its tightly knit community. Yet, it was on a sultry August evening that a kidnapping case emerged, one that would forever change the lives of those involved and cast a long shadow over the city's legacy. At the center of this disturbing tale was a man named Miguel Mikey Salazar. Born in 1978 into a modest family on the outskirts of Tegucigalpa, Miguel had carved out a life that, at first glance, seemed unremarkable. In his mid-30s, he possessed a lean build and had a calm, almost unassuming presence. He worked as a courier for a local business, his days spent navigating the labyrinthine streets of the city, delivering packages and briefcases with a reliability that earned him the respect of both employers and clients. Neighbors knew him as a quiet individual who rarely engaged in gossip, someone who maintained a polite distance yet never aroused suspicion. However, beneath his placid exterior lay a man with a troubled soul and ambitions that extended far beyond the confines of his routine. Mikey's early years had been punctuated by hardship. His father, once a promising artisan, had succumbed to alcoholism after a series of personal tragedies, while his mother struggled to keep the family afloat through relentless work in the local textile mills. These formative experiences had left an indelible mark on him, instilling a sense of bitterness and a yearning for control, a desire to rewrite the narrative of his life, no matter the cost. Over the years, he had experimented with small-time schemes, occasional frauds, minor thefts, and moments of unguarded anger. Yet, nothing of his past ever suggested that he would one day orchestrate a crime of such chilling precision and audacity. On the evening of August 21st, 2014, everything changed. The victim was a young woman named Carolina Reyes, a 19-year-old university student whose future had been filled with promise and hope. Carolina had grown up in one of Tegucigalpa's middle-class neighborhoods, a diligent student known for her bright smile and keen intellect. Her days were filled with lectures, library sessions, and time spent with close friends at the bustling outdoor cafes that line the city's historic center. That night, after finishing a study session at the university library, Carolina began her journey home along a familiar route, a winding path through narrow streets illuminated by the intermittent glow of street lamps and the vibrant hues of nearby murals. Unbeknownst to her, as the humid air settled thick over the city and the night deepened, Miguel Salazar had been watching her. For weeks, he had observed Carolina's routine from a discreet distance, his eyes tracking her movements as if she were a piece on a chessboard. His initial interest had been fueled by a warped desire for power, a need to prove himself superior in a world that had often dismissed him as ordinary. Now, on that fateful night, his internal calculations reached their peak. Carolina vanished without a trace shortly after leaving a quiet intersection near a local market. When she failed to appear at her apartment, and her absence was noted by her worried family, the city's pulse shifted. Rumors began to circulate, and within hours, a missing person alert was broadcast across Tegucigalpa. The early reports painted a picture of a routine disappearance, one that could easily be dismissed as a case of a young woman taking an unscheduled detour or falling victim to the chaotic city life. However, as investigators combed through CCTV footage and eyewitness accounts from the bustling street vendors and passers-by, an alarming pattern emerged. In one of the grainy security recordings, Carolina was seen walking briskly along a narrow street just moments before she disappeared. In the background, a dark sedan had slowed to a crawl near a deserted parking lot. Closer scrutiny revealed a glimpse of a man with a lean build, wearing a faded leather jacket and a cap pulled low over his eyes. Although the image was inconclusive, it hinted at the unmistakable presence of someone whose calculated gaze had been fixed on Carolina. As the hours turned into a restless night, police intensified their search. Teams scoured the city's labyrinthine neighborhoods, leaving no stone unturned. Amid the growing tension, whispers of an organized abduction began to circulate. Local informants hinted that there had been previous incidents of unexplained disappearances in the area, each dismissed as isolated cases. But as the investigation deepened, it became clear that Carolina's disappearance was not an accident. It was the result of a deliberate act, orchestrated with a chilling level of foresight and malice. Back in his modest apartment on the outskirts of the city, Miguel Salazar meticulously prepared for what he believed would be the beginning of his ultimate plan. His modest home concealed a hidden room behind a false wall in the living area, a secret space he had constructed years ago as a hobby, a room where he could retreat from the world's intrusions. Now that room would serve as a temporary holding cell for his prize. In that cold, dim space, rigged with a single, barred window that admitted only a sliver of moonlight, Carolina Reyes would be kept until the time was right. Unaware of the grim fate that awaited her, Carolina's journey from the library that night had ended in darkness, a darkness that Miguel had long prepared for. And as the first tendrils of dawn crept over Tegucigalpa, the disappearance of Carolina Reyes became an inescapable reality, marking the beginning of a case that would haunt the city for years to come. As the sun rose over Tegucigalpa, casting a golden hue over its crumbling colonial buildings and bustling streets, the city woke to the news of Carolina Reyes' disappearance. What had started as a worried family's late-night search soon evolved into a full-blown police investigation. Posters with her photograph were hastily printed and distributed across the city. Her name was repeated on local radio stations, and social media exploded with concern. In a place where crime was not uncommon, the urgency of this particular case gripped the people with an intensity that sent shivers through the community. Carolina was not just another statistic. She was a young woman with a future, a daughter from a respectable family, a student who had shown so much promise. Her father, Eduardo Reyes, was a well-known businessman who ran a string of successful textile factories, and her mother, Valeria, was an elementary school teacher loved by many. The shock of her disappearance rippled through their social circles, prompting not only the involvement of law enforcement, but also a surge of volunteers who scoured the city in search of any sign of her. Meanwhile, in the outskirts of Tegucigalpa, hidden behind a row of neglected buildings, Miguel Salazar sat in his dimly lit apartment, watching the chaos unfold on an old television set. The flickering screen displayed news anchors discussing the case in hurried tones, while images of Carolina's face flashed repeatedly. He leaned back in his worn-out chair, tapping his fingers against the armrest, his mind working through every detail of his plan. Miguel had always considered himself an intelligent man, someone who saw things others didn't. He knew that the authorities would be looking for ransom demands, that they would assume this was a kidnapping for financial gain. But that wasn't why he had taken her. The reasons behind his actions were far more personal, tangled in the web of his own fractured mind. He had chosen Carolina carefully, not just because of her background, but because she represented everything he had never been. She was young, ambitious, full of life. She had opportunities that had never come his way. Miguel had watched her from afar, fascinated by the way she moved through life with a sense of purpose, something he had never possessed. In his mind, taking her was not just about control. It was about rewriting his own story, bending fate to his will. Inside the hidden room he had built, Carolina sat on the cold concrete floor, her wrists bound, her heart pounding in terror. The air was stale, the only source of light a weak bulb that flickered sporadically. She had tried screaming at first, but the thick walls swallowed her cries. She had fought against the restraints, but Miguel had secured them too well. Now she sat in the darkness, her mind racing with questions. Who had taken her? Why? And most terrifying of all, would she ever see her family again? Days passed, and Miguel maintained his careful routine. He still went to work, still carried out his deliveries, still exchanged brief pleasantries with neighbors who had no idea of the horror hidden within his apartment. He was methodical, ensuring that there was nothing to connect him to the disappearance. He watched the investigation unfold from a distance, amused by the desperation in the detectives' voices. They were looking in the wrong places, following leads that led nowhere. He had planned this too well, but Miguel underestimated one thing: the relentless determination of Carolina's father. Eduardo Reyes was not a man who accepted defeat. With his daughter's life at stake, he used every resource available to him, hiring private investigators and pushing the police to dig deeper. He offered a substantial reward for any information, prompting even the most reluctant informants to come forward. And then, an unexpected break came. A street vendor near the intersection where Carolina had disappeared recalled seeing a dark sedan moving slowly that night, its headlights dimmed. At first, the detail had seemed insignificant, lost among the chaos of the city's night traffic. But now, with scrutiny sharpening, it stood out. The vendor described the car's driver, a man of average height, lean build, wearing a worn leather jacket. That description, vague as it was, set off a chain of inquiries. Investigators began combing through surveillance footage once more, this time paying closer attention to vehicles that matched the description. And then, in a grainy frame from a convenience store camera positioned a few blocks from the crime scene, they spotted it. The dark sedan, creeping along the street just minutes before Carolina vanished. The plate number was partially visible. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Authorities cross-referenced the fragment of the plate with vehicle registrations, narrowing down the possibilities. Among the names that surfaced was Miguel Salazar. His record was relatively clean. No major offenses, just minor infractions. But there was something about his profile that caught the attention of one of the detectives. A past history of complaints from former co-workers about inappropriate behavior, an old but troubling report from a woman who had accused him of following her home late at night. It was a weak lead, but in a case like this, any lead was worth pursuing. When officers arrived at Miguel's apartment, they found it in meticulous order. He answered the door with an expression of mild surprise, his demeanor calm. He played the role of an ordinary man perfectly, feigning confusion as they questioned him. He denied owning a dark sedan. He denied being near the area where Carolina disappeared. His alibi was weak, but not immediately dismissible. However, as they prepared to leave, one officer noticed something strange, a subtle draft coming from a section of the wall near the living area. The air in the room was still, yet a faint movement of air suggested that there was a hidden space behind it. The officer's instincts flared. Miguel saw the shift in their expressions, the way their eyes darted to the wall. He knew, in that moment, that he had miscalculated. Panic surged through him, but he masked it with a forced laugh, pretending not to understand their growing suspicion. But it was too late. Within minutes, the officers forced open the concealed door. And there, huddled in the dim light, was Carolina. For a breathless moment, silence filled the air. Then the room erupted into movement. Miguel tried to run, but he didn't get far before being tackled to the ground. Carolina, weak but alive, was quickly pulled to safety. News of her rescue spread like wildfire, sending waves of relief through the city. Her parents wept as they embraced her, overwhelmed by the sheer miracle of her survival. Miguel, on the other hand, was dragged away in handcuffs, his carefully constructed facade crumbling into dust. As the authorities pieced together the details of the case, they uncovered the extent of his twisted obsession. Hidden among his belongings were notes detailing Carolina's daily routines, newspaper clippings about other disappearances that, until now, had never been linked to him. Miguel Salazar had believed himself untouchable. He had thought he was smarter than the system, that his careful planning would keep him safe. But in the end, he was undone not by an oversight in his methods, but by the determination of those who refused to give up on Carolina. The city of Tegucigalpa would remember this case for years to come, a grim reminder of the darkness that sometimes lurked beneath ordinary exteriors. But more than that, it was a testament to resilience, to the unwavering power of those who fight against that darkness, refusing to let it win. The aftermath of Miguel Salazar's arrest was a whirlwind of emotions and revelations. The news cycle ran with the story for days, dissecting every detail of the case, from the moment Carolina disappeared to the dramatic rescue inside the hidden chamber of his apartment. The city, gripped by horror and relief, now turned its attention to the question that haunted everyone's mind. How had this man, this seemingly ordinary figure, hidden his monstrous nature for so long? Investigators delved into Miguel's past, uncovering a deeply troubled history that had remained beneath the surface for years. He had been born into poverty, the son of an alcoholic father and a mother who had abandoned him when he was still a child. Raised by distant relatives who barely acknowledged his existence, Miguel grew up without warmth or guidance, drifting through life without purpose. He was intelligent, yes, but his intelligence was laced with something darker, an inability to form meaningful connections, a festering resentment towards those who had what he never did. He had worked odd jobs throughout his life, never staying anywhere for long. Co-workers recalled him as quiet, withdrawn, but prone to unsettling moments, lingering stares, offhand remarks that sent shivers down spines. Women in particular had felt his presence in ways that made them uneasy. though nothing he did ever crossed the threshold of criminality. Until now. As prosecutors built their case against him, more evidence surfaced. Miguel had been more than just a single-minded kidnapper. He had been watching, waiting, possibly even rehearsing for years. Among his possessions, police found journals filled with obsessive notes, detailed observations of women he had followed, their routines, their habits, their lives reduced to a series of bullet points in his handwriting. The discovery sent shockwaves through the community. Had he done this before? Had others fallen into his hands and simply never been found? The possibility was chilling, and though no direct links to other missing persons could be established, the idea that Miguel Salazar could have been a serial offender was impossible to dismiss. For Carolina Reyes, the ordeal did not end with her rescue. Physically, she had survived, but the scars that remained were not visible. The days spent in captivity had altered something deep within her, stripping away the sense of security she had once carried so effortlessly. Sleep became elusive, nightmares clawed at her whenever she closed her eyes. She flinched at sudden movements, distrusted the familiar streets she had once walked without fear. Her family, desperate to help her heal, surrounded her with love, with therapy, with anything that could piece her back together. But trauma was not something easily undone. For weeks, she remained inside, unwilling to face the world beyond the safety of her home. The whispers of the city followed her wherever she went. People meant well, but their stares, their hushed conversations, only made her feel like she was still trapped, still the girl who had been stolen away in the night. Her story had made her famous, but not in the way anyone would want. But Carolina was strong. Slowly, she began to reclaim her life. She returned to university, though under the watchful eyes of security hired by her father. She spoke to other survivors, learning that the burden she carried was not hers alone. And most importantly, she refused to let Miguel Salazar define her. When the trial began, the courtroom was packed. Journalists, legal experts, members of the public who had followed the case with morbid fascination, all gathered to witness the man behind the crime face judgment. Miguel remained eerily composed throughout the proceedings. He did not lash out, did not break down. He listened as the prosecution painted him as a predator, as Carolina testified against him with trembling hands, as forensic experts described the hidden room in chilling detail. His defense attempted to argue mental illness, a troubled past, a man who had lost his way rather than a cold-blooded criminal. But the jury was unmoved. The facts were undeniable, the evidence overwhelming. When the verdict was read, guilty on all counts, the courtroom erupted in a mixture of cheers and tears. Miguel Salazar was sentenced to life in prison, with no chance of parole. For the city of Tegucigalpa, justice had been served. But for Carolina, true justice was not just about Miguel's punishment. It was about reclaiming the future he had tried to steal from her. Long after Miguel was locked away, the echoes of his crime remained. The case led to new discussions about safety in Tegucigalpa, about the dangers women faced daily, about the hidden threats that lurked in plain sight. People began to pay more attention, to question, to report suspicious behavior rather than dismiss it. For Carolina, life would never be the same, but she refused to let fear dictate her existence. She became an advocate for survivors, sharing her story not as a victim, but as someone who had endured and emerged stronger. And though the memory of those dark days would never fully fade, she chose to live, not in the shadow of what had happened, but in the light of what she still had. Case 6. The streets of Madrid in 1998 were alive with the energy of a city that never truly slept. From the bustling Gran Via to the quiet corners of its historic barrios, the city moved to the rhythm of its people, tourists, locals, and those who lived in the shadows. Among them was Rafael Cardenas, a man whose name would soon be whispered in hushed tones, associated with one of the most chilling kidnappings in Spain's modern history. Rafael was not an ordinary man. To the outside world, he appeared to be a respectable businessman, operating a chain of auto repair shops across the capital. He had a well-groomed appearance, sharp features, and an air of confidence that masked something far darker. Beneath the polished exterior was a man with a past riddled with secrets. His record, though mostly hidden, contained traces of fraud, extortion, and suspected involvement in organized crime. He was known to have connections to underground gambling rings, money laundering operations, and people who could make problems disappear. Despite his success, Rafael was always chasing more. He had debts that could not be settled with mere business earnings. And so, when an opportunity presented itself in the form of a young woman from an affluent Madrid family, he saw a way out. It began with careful observation. Clara Menendez, 22 years old, the daughter of a well-known banking executive, was the perfect target. She lived a structured life, her routines predictable, making her movements easy to track. Raphael studied her for weeks, learning when she left her university, where she met her friends, and how often she traveled alone. He knew she came from money. Her father, Emilio Menendez, was a powerful figure in the financial sector, with enough wealth to make a ransom demand worthwhile. But Raphael was not working alone. His associates, a small but ruthless group of criminals, had been with him for years. They specialized in kidnappings, targeting the vulnerable, demanding ransoms, and in some cases, ensuring that their victims never returned. This time, however, Raphael planned something different. This was not just about money. This was about power, control, and proving to himself that he could manipulate the rich just as easily as he had manipulated the desperate. On the evening of May 4th, Clara was walking home from a dinner with friends near Plaza Mayor. The streets were dimly lit, quiet except for the occasional passing car. She was almost at her apartment when a black van pulled up beside her. The doors slid open, and before she could react, two masked men grabbed her, forcing her inside. Madrid's crime rate at the time had seen its fluctuations, but a high-profile kidnapping in the heart of the city was rare. When Clara's absence was noticed the next morning, her parents immediately contacted the police. The Menendez family had influence, and within hours, the investigation had begun. Yet, Raphael was meticulous. There was no trace of the abduction, no security footage, no witnesses, no immediate demands. It was as if Clara had vanished into thin air. Days passed with no word. The Menendez family waited in agony, fearing the worst. Then on the fifth day, a call came through. A distorted voice demanded 5 million pesetas for Clara's return. No police, no negotiations. If the conditions were not met, she would never be seen again. As the authorities scrambled for leads, Raphael and his team remained hidden in a secluded house on the outskirts of the city. Clara was held in a locked basement, her only contact with the outside world being the voices of her captors. Fear gripped her, but she knew one thing. If she was to survive, she had to find a way to escape before the ransom was paid. The days dragged on inside the dimly lit basement where Clara Menendez was held captive. She had lost track of time, her world reduced to the cold concrete floor beneath her and the muffled voices of her captors beyond the locked door. She could hear their footsteps above, the occasional creak of the wooden floorboards reminding her that life continued beyond her prison. But for her, every moment felt frozen in a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. Rafael Cardenas had orchestrated this entire operation with precision. He wasn't a man who acted impulsively. He had spent months perfecting the details, ensuring that every loose end was tied, every possible mistake accounted for. Yet, as the days passed, an unease settled over him. This was supposed to be simple: grab the girl, make the demand, collect the money, and disappear. But something felt off. The Menendez family had not responded the way he had anticipated. There were no desperate public pleas, no reckless attempts to negotiate with the kidnappers. The police were, of course, involved, but their movements were careful, almost too careful. Raphael had expected a faster response, a willingness to comply without question, but it seemed that Emilio Menendez was not a man who would be easily manipulated. Inside her prison, Clara was not completely without hope. Though she was weak, hungry, and exhausted, her mind remained sharp. She listened to every sound, memorized the patterns of her captors' movements, and assessed the weaknesses in their routines. She had been blindfolded when she was taken, but from the way the air smelled, damp and earthy, she guessed that she was being kept somewhere outside the city, possibly in an old farmhouse or a secluded property. The men who guarded her were not always careful. They spoke freely at times, assuming she was too afraid to listen. She had overheard one of them mention a name, Javier. He seemed to be the one who brought food to her, a silent figure who never spoke directly to her, but left a plate of stale bread and water at the bottom of the stairs before locking the door again. If she could get through to him, find a weakness in his resolve, she might have a chance. Meanwhile, the police had begun closing in. Though there were no immediate clues, they had started to trace the ransom call. The distorted voice had been an attempt to throw them off, but modern forensic techniques allowed them to isolate small details, background noises, echoes, even the faint hum of what sounded like an old refrigerator running in the background. With this information, they had narrowed their search to rural properties outside Madrid, particularly those that had been abandoned or recently sold under suspicious circumstances. Raphael, unaware of how close they were getting, was growing more impatient. He had given the family a deadline, and if they failed to comply, Clara would be disposed of. This wasn't his first kidnapping, but it was certainly his most complicated one. There was something about this case that unsettled him. Maybe it was the fact that Clara wasn't begging for her life, wasn't screaming or breaking down like the others had before. She was silent, observing, waiting. He knew that kind of silence meant danger. As the 7th day approached, the Menendez family made their move. Instead of simply following the ransom demands, they used their powerful connections to coordinate with law enforcement behind the scenes. A discreet transfer of money was arranged, but the real plan was to track the drop location and follow anyone who retrieved it. Clara, sensing that time was running out, knew she had to act. That night, when Javier brought her food, she forced herself to speak, her voice hoarse from days of near silence. She told him she knew his name, that she knew he was not like the others. She played on his doubts, on his hesitations, planting the seed of uncertainty in his mind. She had nothing to lose. Outside, the police had begun their final operation. Using hidden surveillance, they had identified a vehicle that had been making suspicious trips back and forth from the suspected hideout. It was registered to one of Raphael's associates. The net was tightening, and soon, there would be nowhere left to run. Raphael, sensing that things were not going as planned, made a final, desperate decision, one that would determine Clara's fate and his own. The 8th day of Clara Menendez's captivity began like the others, cold, dark, and silent. But outside, beyond the walls of her prison, the world was moving faster than Rafael Cardenas had anticipated. The police were closing in, and the Menendez family, using every resource available, had positioned themselves for a final move. Clara, weakened but not broken, had spent the night replaying every detail she had gathered. She had listened carefully to the routine of her captors, memorizing the patterns of their footsteps, the creaks in the wooden floor above, and the times they checked on her. More importantly, she had studied Javier, the one weak link in the operation. He wasn't as hardened as the others. He hesitated before locking the door, avoided eye contact, and left food without a word. She had seen men like him before, those who were in too deep and didn't know how to get out. By the time Javier returned with her morning meal, something in his posture had changed. His hands trembled slightly as he set the plate down, his breathing unsteady. Clara knew her words from the night before had taken root. She had spoken softly, calmly, telling him that she understood. She knew he wasn't a monster like the others, that he still had a choice. And now, as he lingered for a fraction of a second too long, she knew she had gotten through to him. Outside the abandoned farmhouse where she was kept, unmarked police vehicles had taken their positions. The lead detective, Gabriel Sanchez, had spent the last 48 hours without sleep, meticulously piecing together the puzzle. He knew Rafael Cardenas by reputation. His methods were cruel, but he was not reckless. That was why Sanchez had decided to play his own game carefully, watching and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Rafael, however, was not an easy man to trap. He had noticed the shift in energy among his men. Javier, in particular, had become more withdrawn. He no longer looked Rafael in the eyes, and took longer to complete simple tasks. Rafael had seen men fall apart before, and he knew when someone was on the verge of breaking. If Javier became a problem, he would be dealt with. But before he could make that decision, the ransom exchange was set to take place. Rafael had meticulously planned it, a simple, direct handover. No tricks. The money would be transferred, and once it was confirmed, Clara would be released. But he had underestimated the Menendez family. Emilio Menendez was not the type of man to negotiate with criminals. He was a businessman, and business was all about leverage. As the exchange was initiated, Rafael watched from a distance. His associate had gone to collect the money, but something felt off. There was no visible police presence, no obvious trap, but Rafael had been in this game long enough to sense when things weren't right. And then it happened. His phone vibrated. A message from one of his men at the farmhouse. Javier is missing. His blood ran cold. He knew immediately what that meant. Either Javier had fled, or worse, he had turned against them. There was no time to waste. If Javier had betrayed them, then the police were already closing in. He had to disappear. Inside the farmhouse, Clara heard the commotion above. The rushed footsteps, the sound of doors slamming. Something was happening. And then for the first time, the door to the basement creaked open. Not by Javier, but by a man she didn't recognize. His face was unfamiliar, but the gun in his hand wasn't. She braced herself, But before the man could step closer, a voice echoed from above. Policia, manos arriba. The farmhouse erupted in chaos. Gunshots rang out as Raphael's men fought back, but they were outmatched. The police had surrounded the building, their movements precise and coordinated. Raphael, realizing the operation had crumbled, made a final, desperate move. He ran. Clara, still shackled to the wall, felt hope for the first time in days. She could hear the officers moving through the house, the shouts growing closer. And then, finally, the basement door swung open again. This time, it wasn't one of her captors. It was the police. The moment she was freed, Clara collapsed into their arms, her body weak but her mind still sharp. She had survived. Raphael Cardenas, however, was nowhere to be found. He had vanished into the night, slipping away before the police could catch him. But his freedom would not last forever. His name was now at the top of every international watch list. His empire had crumbled, and there was no place left for him to hide. For Clara Menendez, the nightmare was over. But the scars, both visible and unseen, would remain. She had faced darkness and emerged stronger. And as she stepped outside into the morning light, she knew one thing for certain. She would never be a victim again. Case 7. The city of San Salvador, El Salvador, has long been a place where danger and uncertainty lurk in the shadows. In the early 2000s, amid growing crime rates and an increase in gang-related violence, one particular case of kidnapping would send shockwaves through the capital. This was not just another statistic in the long list of crimes that plagued the city. It was a meticulously planned and executed abduction, carried out by a man whose name would later become synonymous with fear, Salvador El Lobo Mendieta. Salvador Mendieta was not an ordinary criminal. Unlike the reckless gang members who roamed the streets, he was calculated, intelligent, and methodical. He had spent years operating beneath the radar, building a network of criminals who specialized in kidnapping for ransom. With a history of working in logistics, he knew how to move people and money without detection. By the time he reached his 40s, Mendieta had perfected his craft. His operations were highly organized. He selected his victims carefully, always ensuring that they belonged to wealthy families who could afford to pay. Mendieta would never act on impulse. He spent months studying his targets, learning their routines, weaknesses, and vulnerabilities. He employed a team of enforcers, informants, and intermediaries who made his kidnappings almost impossible to trace. But this time, he had set his sights on a target that would ultimately prove to be his undoing. In the spring of 2004, Lucia Gonzalez was a 22-year-old university student studying law at one of San Salvador's most prestigious institutions. Born into a family of prominent lawyers, she had a bright future ahead of her. But wealth often attracted the wrong kind of attention. Unbeknownst to her, she had become the next mark on Salvador Mendieta's list. Lucia followed the same routine every day. She would attend her morning classes, meet with friends for lunch, and return home in the afternoon. Her parents, deeply aware of the dangers in the city, had always advised her to be cautious. She never traveled alone at night, always informed her family of her whereabouts, and stayed away from high-crime areas. But none of these precautions would be enough to save her from what was coming. Mendieta had been watching her for months. He knew her schedule down to the minute. He knew which streets she walked, where she parked her car, and even the security measures in place at her home. Every detail had been studied with the precision of a predator hunting its prey. Then, on the fateful day of June 10th, he made his move. It happened in broad daylight. Lucia had just finished her last class of the day, and was heading towards her car in the university parking lot. As she reached for her keys, a van with darkened windows pulled up beside her. The back door slid open, and before she could react, 2 men grabbed her. A hand covered her mouth before she could scream. Within seconds, she was pulled into the van, and the door slammed shut. The vehicle sped away, leaving behind nothing but a dropped phone and scattered papers from her bag. The entire operation lasted no more than 10 seconds. Security cameras captured blurry footage of the van, but the license plate had been removed. Witnesses were too shocked to react in time. By the time campus security arrived, Lucia was gone. News of the abduction spread rapidly. Her family, desperate for answers, turned to both law enforcement and private investigators. But in San Salvador, kidnappings were an all-too-common occurrence. The police had their hands full with ongoing gang violence, and cases like these often took weeks, if not months, to solve. What no one knew at the time was that Lucia was already being held in an undisclosed location, and her captor had no intention of making mistakes. Lucia Gonzalez woke up to absolute darkness. Her body ached, her wrists and ankles bound tightly with rope, her mouth covered with thick duct tape. The last thing she remembered was the sensation of being dragged into a van. Then nothing. Now she found herself in what felt like a cold, damp room. The air smelled of mildew and gasoline, and a faint buzzing sound echoed in the distance. As she adjusted to her surroundings, she realized she was lying on a concrete floor. The temperature was cold enough to make her shiver. She tried to move, but the bindings cut into her skin, making every attempt at escape painful. A dim light flickered above, casting eerie shadows against the walls. It was clear that wherever she was, it wasn't some random hideout. It was a place chosen with care, a place designed for people like her to disappear. Salvador El Lobo Mendieta had perfected the art of hiding his victims. He never used the same location twice. Each time he orchestrated a kidnapping, he chose a different abandoned warehouse, an isolated house in the countryside, or even underground bunkers in cartel-controlled territories. This time, Lucia had been brought to an old, abandoned slaughterhouse on the outskirts of San Salvador. This building had once been a meat processing plant, but had been shut down years ago after a string of safety violations. Now it was nothing more than a decaying shell, a perfect place to keep someone without fear of discovery. The walls were stained with years of neglect, and the metal hooks that once held animal carcasses now served a far more sinister purpose. Lucia wasn't alone. A man stood in the corner, watching her with unsettling patience. He was one of Mendieta's enforcers, a man known only as El Sombra, the Shadow. He was silent, unmoving, almost as if he were waiting for something. After what felt like hours, a door creaked open. Footsteps echoed through the empty hall, slow and deliberate. Lucia felt her heart pound against her chest. A silhouette emerged from the dim light, a man dressed in dark clothes, his face hidden beneath a hat. Salvador Mendieta had arrived. Mendieta never rushed a ransom demand. Unlike other criminals who panicked and made hasty phone calls, he operated like a businessman. He knew exactly when to reach out to a victim's family, how much to demand, and what psychological tactics to use. When he finally called Lucia's family, it had been over 12 hours since she had vanished. By then, panic had fully set in. The Gonzalez family received a call from an untraceable number. The voice on the other end was calm, almost professional. He didn't scream, didn't threaten, he simply laid out the terms. Lucia would be returned safely in exchange for $500,000 in cash. No police, no investigations, no questions. The family had 48 hours to comply. The sum was enormous, even for a wealthy family. It wasn't just about the money, it was about making a statement. Mendieta didn't just kidnap for ransom, he kidnapped to instill fear. By demanding such an outrageous amount, he was sending a message to others in the elite class. No one is untouchable. Lucia's father, Roberto Gonzalez, was a powerful man. A senior attorney with strong government connections, he had spent his life fighting against corruption. But even he knew the brutal reality of his country. The police were often powerless against criminals like Mendieta. Going to the authorities could mean risking Lucia's life. Roberto had two options: pay the ransom and hope for Lucia's safe return, or involve law enforcement and gamble with her fate. Meanwhile, inside the slaughterhouse, Lucia was trapped in an agonizing limbo. She was fed minimal amounts of food and water, just enough to keep her alive. Mendieta's men never spoke to her. They only watched, ensuring she didn't try to escape. Her mind raced with fear. Would her family pay? Would she ever see them again? The hours dragged on like an eternity. She had no way of knowing how much time had passed. The only sound that filled the room was the occasional dripping of water from the ceiling and the distant echoes of movement outside. Then something changed. Lucia heard an argument outside the room. Raised voices. Footsteps moving quickly. Something was wrong. She didn't know it yet, but Mendieta's perfect plan was beginning to unravel. Lucia held her breath as the argument outside intensified. She couldn't make out the words, but the urgency in their voices sent a chilling realization through her. Something had gone wrong. Mendieta's men were disciplined, trained to carry out orders without hesitation. They were mercenaries, not petty criminals. A disagreement among them meant only one thing. Someone was either getting cold feet or trying to change the deal. The door to the slaughterhouse burst open. Heavy footsteps pounded against the concrete floor, and Lucia could hear rapid breathing. Someone was pacing. A deep voice, filled with anger, broke through the tension. Lucia squeezed her eyes shut, praying they weren't about to kill her. Unknown to her, Mendietta's network was crumbling from the inside. One of his own men, Carlos Ortega, nicknamed El Vibora, had been secretly negotiating with a rival gang. Ortega had grown tired of taking orders, of living in the shadows while Mendieta hoarded the wealth. He wanted a bigger share of the profits, and more importantly, he wanted control. He had been feeding information to an enemy cartel, one that had been waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike at Mendieta's operation. The kidnapping of Lucia Gonzalez had given them just that. Mendieta had sensed Ortega's disloyalty, but he had underestimated how deep the betrayal ran. Now, his entire empire was at risk of collapse. The voices outside became more aggressive. Then a loud gunshot. Lucia's entire body stiffened as she heard something heavy collapse to the ground. Silence followed, thick and suffocating. Then, the door creaked open. Lucia flinched as a shadow loomed over her. A blade sliced through the ropes around her wrists and ankles, and rough hands grabbed her arm, forcing her to stand. It was Ortega. Carlos Ortega had no intention of letting Lucia go. Not yet. He had killed Mendieta, but now he needed leverage. If he played this right, he could not only take over Mendieta's operation, but also extort more money from the Gonzalez family. Lucia was dragged out of the slaughterhouse into the humid night air. The city lights of San Salvador flickered in the distance, a cruel reminder of the world she had been ripped away from. She was thrown into another vehicle, the engine roaring to life as Ortega barked orders at his men. Lucia knew that whatever happened next, it wouldn't be freedom. She tried to memorize the route, hoping for any chance of escape. But Ortega was meticulous. He took winding roads, back alleys, and unmarked paths until they reached a new location, an abandoned motel on the outskirts of the city. Inside, the walls were covered in graffiti, the floors littered with debris. The air smelled of dust and decay. Ortega pushed Lucia into a chair and pulled out his phone. This time, the ransom demand was different. $1 million. Roberto Gonzalez, desperate and out of options, had already gathered the original $500,000. But now, with a new captor in charge, the demand had doubled. The rules had changed. Roberto Gonzalez knew he couldn't trust Ortega. He had already hesitated with Mendieta, but this was different. He had no guarantee Lucia would be returned alive. So he made a call of his own. Despite his deep distrust of the police, he reached out to Unidad Especializada contra el Crimen Organizado, El Salvador's elite anti-crime task force. These weren't the corrupt officers who looked the other way. These were professionals trained to take down organized criminals. A plan was set in motion. The exchange would happen at a secluded location, an old warehouse near the docks. Ortega, believing himself to be in complete control, agreed to the meeting. Lucia, exhausted and terrified, was shoved into a van once more. As they drove, she could feel the tension in the air. Ortega's men were on edge. They had no idea they were heading into an ambush. When they arrived, the warehouse was dimly lit, the only sound being the distant crashing of waves against the docks. Roberto Gonzalez stood in the center, a briefcase of cash in his hand. Ortega, smug and overconfident, approached. He ordered his men to bring Lucia forward. Then, in the blink of an eye, the trap was sprung. From the shadows, a team of elite officers emerged, their weapons raised. The air exploded with the sound of gunfire. Ortega's men scrambled for cover, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. Lucia dropped to the ground as bullets whizzed past her. She felt hands grab her, pulling her to safety. She could hear the shouts of officers, the screams of wounded men, and then silence. Ortega lay on the ground, blood pooling beneath him. His plan had failed. His betrayal had sealed his fate. Lucia Gonzalez was finally free. She was rushed into her father's arms, sobbing with relief. The nightmare was over. The police recovered the ransom money, but Roberto Gonzalez didn't care. His daughter was safe, and that was all that mattered. The remnants of Mendieta's organization were dismantled in the following weeks. Some fled, others were arrested. But the message was clear. San Salvador would no longer be ruled by fear. Lucia never spoke publicly about her ordeal. The trauma of those days haunted her, but she refused to let it define her. She had survived, and that was enough. Case 8. In the late 2010s, when the cryptocurrency boom reached unprecedented heights, a man named Jonathan Jace Whitmore emerged as one of the most influential figures in the industry. Charismatic, highly intelligent, and with a background in computer science and finance, Whitmore was the CEO of Nexa Capital, a blockchain-based financial firm that promised to revolutionize digital assets. Born and raised in a wealthy suburb of San Francisco, Whitmore had always been ahead of his peers. He graduated from MIT at the age of 22 with a double major in artificial intelligence and financial engineering. He was a natural entrepreneur. His first successful venture was an AI-driven trading bot that made him a millionaire before he even turned 25. But that was just the beginning. In 2017, during the height of Bitcoin's meteoric rise, Whitmore founded Nexa Capital with the promise of creating a decentralized financial ecosystem that would make traditional banking obsolete. The company's main product was NEX token, a cryptocurrency that Whitmore claimed would be the backbone of a fully autonomous digital economy. Investors from all over the world poured their money into the project, trusting his expertise and vision. By 2019, Nexa Capital had amassed billions of dollars in funding. Whitmore was hailed as a crypto visionary, often compared to tech moguls like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos. He made appearances at major financial conferences, speaking about the future of decentralized finance, and even secured endorsements from celebrities and venture capitalists. But beneath the surface, Nexa Capital was nothing more than an elaborate Ponzi scheme. The first signs of trouble began appearing in late 2020 when investors started noticing discrepancies in the company's financial statements. Despite Nexa Capital claiming exponential growth, auditors could not verify the existence of the assets that supposedly backed NEX token. As concerns grew, a few whistleblowers within the company began leaking internal documents that exposed how Whitmore and his top executives were siphoning investor funds into offshore accounts. Yet, the fraud continued undetected for another year. Whitmore reassured investors with staged announcements about new partnerships and technological breakthroughs. Meanwhile, he continued living a life of extreme luxury, buying multi-million-dollar mansions, private jets, and rare supercars, all funded by the very people who had trusted him with their savings. In mid-2021, the SEC launched an investigation after an anonymous insider provided evidence that Nexa Capital had no actual blockchain infrastructure. The entire project was a lie. The NEX token was not backed by any real-world assets, and Whitmore had been using funds from new investors to pay off older ones, the textbook definition of a Ponzi scheme. But Whitmore was not ready to go down without a fight. Instead of complying with authorities, he fled the United States, withdrawing hundreds of millions in Bitcoin and Ethereum. Law enforcement agencies, including the FBI and Interpol, immediately issued an international warrant for his arrest. For the next several months, Whitmore evaded capture. Some reports suggested he was hiding in Dubai, while others placed him in remote parts of Eastern Europe, constantly moving from one country to another to avoid detection. The crypto community, once his biggest supporters, turned against him, labeling him a fraudster of the century. By early 2022, Nexa Capital collapsed entirely. Investors lost a collective $8.5 billion, making it the largest cryptocurrency fraud in U.S. history. Thousands of people, from small-time traders to institutional investors, were left financially ruined. Some had lost their life savings. But the biggest question remained: where was Jace Whitmore? For nearly a year, Jonathan Jace Whitmore remained a ghost. His last known location was an upscale private villa in the outskirts of Dubai, but by the time authorities raided the property, he had already disappeared. Investigators found high-end electronics, fake passports, and multiple encrypted laptops, but no sign of the man himself. The world watched in disbelief as one of the biggest financial criminals in modern history managed to stay ahead of law enforcement, slipping through the cracks of international jurisdictions. With over $8.5 billion in stolen funds, Whitmore had the resources to live comfortably for the rest of his life. The cryptocurrency he had siphoned was untraceable, stored in decentralized wallets that law enforcement agencies struggled to crack. Rumors spread that he was hiding somewhere in Eastern Europe, possibly in Montenegro or Serbia, where extradition laws were more lenient. Others believed he had fled to a remote island in the Caribbean, using his fortune to buy protection from corrupt officials. Meanwhile, back in the United States, the victims of Nexa Capital's collapse were left to pick up the pieces. Thousands of investors lost everything. Some had emptied their retirement accounts, while others had taken out loans believing in Whitmore's promises of untold wealth. Several class action lawsuits were filed against Nexa Capital's remaining executives, but without the main perpetrator in custody, justice felt distant. The FBI, SEC, and Interpol launched a coordinated international manhunt. His name was added to the FBI's most wanted list, and a $25 million bounty was placed on his capture, the highest ever for a financial fugitive. Investigators worked around the clock, tracking his last known communications, analyzing blockchain transactions, and interviewing former employees who might have known his escape plan. And then finally they got a break. In August 2022, an undercover intelligence operation intercepted an encrypted message sent from a hidden crypto wallet linked to Whitmore. The transaction was small, just $500 worth of Bitcoin, but its significance was monumental. The wallet had been dormant for months, and now it was suddenly active again. Investigators traced the transaction to a financial hub in Buenos Aires, Argentina. The pattern was clear. Whitmore was still moving funds, likely using middlemen to launder money. A task force was immediately deployed to Argentina. Undercover agents infiltrated the city's elite circles, watching for signs of Whitmore's presence. They scanned luxury car rentals, private yacht bookings, and high-end hotels, looking for a man who had been a ghost for nearly a year. Then, in September 2022, a breakthrough. A CCTV camera at a private airport captured a familiar figure boarding a chartered jet. Though he was wearing a fake beard and glasses, his mannerisms were unmistakable. It was Whitmore. Authorities now had confirmation that he was in Argentina, but the question remained, where was he heading next? Investigators worked frantically to track the jet's destination. The flight was registered under a false name, but air traffic control confirmed its course, Sao Paulo, Brazil. As soon as the jet landed, Brazilian authorities, working alongside Interpol, surrounded the airstrip. Officers stormed the aircraft, weapons drawn, demanding the passengers exit one by one. Among them was a tall man in an expensive suit, his face partially covered by sunglasses. When the officers pulled them off, there was no mistaking it. Jonathan Whitmore had finally been caught. His arrest sent shockwaves through the financial world. The man who had deceived millions, stolen billions, and outrun law enforcement for nearly 2 years was now in custody. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse in Sao Paulo as news stations broadcasted the footage of his capture. In the United States, Nexa Capital's victims finally saw justice in motion. But Whitmore wasn't going down without a fight. His legal team, paid with his remaining hidden fortune, launched an aggressive defense strategy, arguing that cryptocurrency laws were still vague and that Nexa Capital had operated within legal gray areas. The case was shaping up to be one of the most complex financial trials in U.S. history. And beneath it all, a more troubling question loomed. If Whitmore had stolen over $8.5 billion and authorities had only recovered $2 billion, where was the rest of the money? As the world watched, Jonathan Whitmore was extradited from Brazil to the United States in October 2022. He arrived under heavy security, shackled and surrounded by federal agents, his once arrogant demeanor now replaced by a grim expression. The man who had once lived in private jets and five-star resorts now wore a government-issued jumpsuit, facing the harsh reality of his new life. The U.S. Justice Department wasted no time in charging him with wire fraud, securities fraud, conspiracy to commit money laundering, and financial crimes on an unprecedented scale. The case against him was overwhelming, with investigators uncovering thousands of encrypted emails, fraudulent contracts, and testimony from former Nexa Capital employees who had turned against him. But despite the mountain of evidence, Whitmore wasn't ready to give up. He hired one of the most expensive defense teams in the country, a group of high-powered attorneys who specialized in white-collar crime. Their strategy was simple but dangerous. Argue that Nexa Capital had been a legitimate business and that cryptocurrency regulations were unclear at the time, making his actions legally ambiguous. Whitmore's legal team also claimed that his prosecution was politically motivated, a desperate attempt by the U.S. government to make an example out of him. His lawyers filed motion after motion, delaying the trial for months, while in the background, forensic accountants continued hunting for the missing billions. By early 2023, investigators had only managed to recover $3.2 billion of the estimated $8.5 billion Whitmore had stolen. The rest of the money had seemingly vanished. Authorities combed through offshore bank accounts, shell companies, and crypto transactions, but the bulk of Whitmore's fortune remained untraceable. Some believed he had used advanced privacy coins like Monero or Cash to hide his funds. Others speculated that he had secret associates still moving his money for him, keeping it hidden until he found a way to reclaim it. Despite being behind bars, Whitmore remained a financial ghost, one of the most skilled fraudsters in history, and one who had potentially hidden billions beyond the reach of law enforcement. The mystery deepened when a series of anonymous Bitcoin transactions were detected, moving small amounts of crypto from wallets previously linked to Whitmore. Each transfer was carefully fragmented, using hundreds of microtransactions to avoid triggering fraud alerts. Someone somewhere was still pulling the strings. The FBI believed that Whitmore had left behind detailed instructions for trusted associates, ensuring that his wealth wouldn't be seized, even if he were imprisoned. Agents began monitoring his former inner circle, friends, business partners, even former Nexa Capital employees, watching for any signs of movement. Then, a breakthrough came from an unlikely source. In April 2023, an informant approached investigators, offering to sell information on Whitmore's hidden assets. The individual, who remained anonymous for security reasons, claimed that a portion of the missing funds were hidden in secret crypto wallets controlled by Whitmore's network in Hong Kong and the United Arab Emirates. In exchange for immunity from prosecution, the informant provided authorities with a series of private encryption keys. When federal agents tested the keys, they successfully accessed a small fraction of the stolen funds, around $200 million in Bitcoin. It was a significant win, but also a chilling reminder. If this was just a small portion of Whitmore's hidden wealth, how much more was still out there? By the summer of 2023, the world's attention turned to Whitmore's trial in New York City. Reporters flooded the courtroom, news stations ran live coverage, and legal experts debated whether the government had enough evidence to convict him. The prosecution laid out a devastating case, detailing how Whitmore knowingly defrauded investors, manipulated cryptocurrency prices, and laundered billions through an intricate web of transactions. Former Nexa Capital employees testified, revealing how the company's success had been an illusion from the start. Investors believed they were making money, but in reality, Whitmore had been using new deposits to pay out old ones, a classic Ponzi scheme, disguised as a tech revolution. Despite overwhelming evidence, Whitmore's legal team fought back aggressively. His lawyers discredited witnesses, challenged forensic evidence, and continued pushing the idea that cryptocurrency laws were too vague to hold him accountable. They argued that the investors knew the risks, and that Nexa Capital had been no different from other high-risk financial ventures. The jury deliberated for over 2 weeks, reviewing thousands of pages of evidence. Then, on October 17, 2023, the verdict was announced. Whitmore was found guilty on all charges. The court sentenced him to 245 years in federal prison, ensuring that he would never walk free again. His remaining assets were seized, and Nexa Capital was officially declared defunct. But even as Whitmore sat in a maximum security facility, one question remained unanswered. Where was the rest of the money? The final chapter of Jonathan Whitmore's story was still unwritten. In the months following his conviction, authorities continued tracking the missing billions, but many believed that the full amount would never be recovered. The crypto world had changed forever, and Whitmore's case had become a cautionary tale of unchecked greed, deception, and the dark side of digital finance. And somewhere, in the shadows of the internet, his fortune might still be waiting. Case 9. In the rapidly evolving world of cryptocurrency, few figures have risen and fallen as dramatically as Du Hyung Kwon, commonly known as Du Kwon. Born in South Korea, Kwon was a brilliant computer scientist and entrepreneur who co-founded Terraform Labs in 2018. His vision was to create a decentralized financial system that could challenge traditional banking structures. Central to this vision were 2 digital currencies, Terra USD, UST, an algorithmic stablecoin designed to maintain a 1:1 peg with the US dollar, and its sister token Luna. Together, they promised stability and high yields, attracting investors worldwide. By early 2022, Terra USD and Luna had achieved significant market capitalization, with Luna reaching an all-time high of $119.51. Investors were enticed by the promise of stability and lucrative returns, leading to a surge in demand. However, beneath the surface, the algorithmic mechanisms designed to maintain Terra USD's peg were fundamentally flawed. In May 2022, a series of large withdrawals from the Anchor protocol, a lending and borrowing platform associated with Terra, initiated a downward spiral. As confidence waned, Terra USD lost its peg, and the interconnected nature of the 2 tokens led to a catastrophic collapse. In a matter of days, Luna's value plummeted to virtually zero, erasing approximately $40 billion in market value and devastating countless investors. In the aftermath, Investigations revealed that Quan and Terraform Labs had misled investors about the stability and backing of TerraUSD. They had falsely claimed that the stablecoin was supported by tangible assets and robust algorithms, masking the inherent vulnerabilities in its design. As legal pressures mounted, Quan fled South Korea, leading to a global manhunt. In March 2023, he was arrested in Montenegro while attempting to travel using falsified documents. After serving a brief sentence for document forgery, Montenegro extradited Quan to the United States in December 2024 to face multiple charges, including securities fraud, wire fraud, commodities fraud, and conspiracy to defraud investors. In a separate civil case, Terraform Labs and Quan agreed to pay over $4.5 billion, following a unanimous jury verdict, holding them liable for orchestrating a years-long fraud that led to massive investor losses. The collapse of TerraUSD and Luna not only led to significant financial losses, but also prompted a re-evaluation of the risks associated with algorithmic stablecoins and the broader cryptocurrency market. Regulatory bodies worldwide have since intensified their scrutiny of digital assets, aiming to protect investors from similar fraudulent schemes in the future. Quan's rise to prominence in the cryptocurrency space had once seemed unstoppable. To many, he was a visionary, an innovator who had cracked the code to financial stability in an industry notorious for its volatility. But beneath the image of success lay an intricate web of deception that would ultimately unravel, leaving behind financial ruin, unanswered questions, and a massive legal battle that would stretch across multiple countries. Terraform Labs, the company Quan co-founded, was built on the promise of decentralization and financial inclusivity. With TerraUSD, UST, at its core, Quan promoted the stablecoin as a revolutionary alternative to traditional banking. The idea was simple yet bold. Instead of being backed by fiat reserves like conventional stablecoins, USDT, USDC, UST maintained its value through a complex algorithm tied to Luna, Terraform Labs' sister token. If UST's value fluctuated, the system would either mint or burn Luna tokens to restore its dollar peg. For a time, the system seemed to work. Investors saw a seemingly stable asset with a promise of high returns through the Anchor protocol, a lending platform within the Terra ecosystem. At its peak, Anchor was offering an astonishing 20% annual yield on UST deposits, an incentive too tempting to ignore. However, those who understood the underlying mechanics saw red flags early on. Unlike traditional stablecoins, which relied on tangible assets to maintain their peg, TerraUSD's stability was wholly dependent on market confidence. If that confidence wavered, the algorithmic mechanism designed to maintain the peg could collapse in a feedback loop, something Quan and his team downplayed. Despite concerns, retail and institutional investors poured billions into the ecosystem, lured by its meteoric rise and Quan's relentless self-assurance. Through social media and public appearances, Quan dismissed critics with a mix of arrogance and bravado. He often taunted skeptics, calling them poor or stupid for doubting the viability of TerraUSD. His dismissive attitude, however, masked an underlying fear. He knew that if the system were ever tested on a large scale, it might not withstand the pressure. By May 2022, cracks in the TerraUSD system were starting to form. A series of large withdrawals from Anchor protocol began triggering a downward spiral. Whales, large investors with substantial holdings, started exiting their UST positions. The sell-off put immense pressure on the algorithmic stabilization mechanism. As more UST flooded the market, the peg started to slip. The panic spread rapidly. Retail investors, many of whom had put their life savings into TerraUSD, started to cash out. The system, which relied on continuous demand for Luna to stabilize UST, suddenly found itself overwhelmed. With the peg slipping further, Terraform Labs scrambled to deploy its Bitcoin reserves in a desperate bid to restore confidence. But it was too late. Within days, Luna's value collapsed from over $100 to fractions of a cent. Investors, who had once believed in Quan's vision, saw their fortunes wiped out overnight. Billions vanished in what became one of the most dramatic financial crashes in cryptocurrency history. For many, the real shock came not from the collapse itself, but from how quickly it happened. The algorithmic stabilization mechanism, which was supposed to ensure long-term stability, had instead acted as a ticking time bomb. Quan, who had once mocked critics, now found himself at the center of a storm, accused of misleading investors, manipulating market sentiment, and worst of all, knowingly promoting an unsustainable system. In the immediate aftermath, regulators and law enforcement agencies launched investigations into Terraform Labs. Governments across multiple jurisdictions, including South Korea, the United States, and Singapore, began scrutinizing the collapse. The U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC, quickly labeled TerraUSD and Luna as unregistered securities, accusing Terraform Labs of engaging in deceptive practices. Meanwhile, Kwon had vanished. His last known location was in Singapore, but by the time authorities issued a warrant for his arrest, he had already fled. South Korea revoked his passport and placed him on an international wanted list. His movements became a mystery, with speculation suggesting he was hiding in Dubai, Serbia, or Montenegro. For months, Kwon evaded capture, using his financial resources and network to stay ahead of law enforcement. But in March 2023, he was finally apprehended in Montenegro while attempting to board a private jet using falsified travel documents. Montenegro authorities detained him on charges of document forgery, but the real battle was just beginning. Both the US and South Korea were demanding his extradition. As the legal proceedings dragged on, victims of the Terra collapse demanded justice. Many had lost everything, from small retail investors to large hedge funds that had placed massive bets on Terra's continued success. Lawsuits piled up, each accusing Kwon of orchestrating one of the largest financial frauds in modern history. Yet, even as he sat in detention, Kwon maintained his innocence. In statements released through his lawyers, he claimed Terra's collapse was an unfortunate event rather than deliberate fraud. He insisted that the market downturn, not deception, had led to the crash. But evidence suggested otherwise. Internal communications revealed that Terraform Labs executives had been aware of potential weaknesses long before the collapse. By December 2024, Montenegro had finally approved Kwon's extradition to the United States, where he faced multiple federal charges, including securities fraud, wire fraud, commodities fraud, and conspiracy to commit financial crimes. The case against him was one of the most significant in financial history, comparable to past high-profile fraud cases. In addition to criminal proceedings, Terraform Labs and Kwon faced civil lawsuits from investors and regulators. The SEC secured a landmark $4.5 billion judgment against them, marking one of the largest financial penalties in the crypto industry's history. The verdict sent shockwaves through the industry, reinforcing the need for stricter regulatory oversight and more transparency in digital asset projects. The Terra collapse had far-reaching consequences beyond its immediate financial impact. It forced regulators worldwide to take a harder stance on cryptocurrency projects, particularly those involving algorithmic stablecoins. Governments introduced new policies to prevent similar collapses. The European Union fast-tracked the markets in crypto assets, MiCA regulation, while the US proposed stricter guidelines on stablecoin reserves and transparency requirements. Meanwhile, former Terra investors continued to grapple with their losses. Many had placed their trust and their savings into a system that had promised financial freedom but delivered only devastation. Stories of individuals losing homes, retirement funds, and years of savings became all too common. As for Do Kwon, his future remained uncertain. While he awaited trial in the US, South Korea was also seeking to prosecute him. If convicted, he faced the possibility of spending decades behind bars, a dramatic fall from grace for a man who had once been celebrated as a crypto genius. His story became a cautionary tale, a stark reminder that in the unregulated world of cryptocurrency, promises of stability and high returns often come with hidden dangers. Investors learn the hard way that not all innovation leads to progress, and that sometimes the brightest stars burn out the fastest. By early 2025, the legal battle surrounding Do Kwon had escalated into one of the most highly publicized financial trials in modern history. The collapse of TerraUSD had triggered investigations from multiple government agencies, and Kwon was at the center of it all. Extradited to the United States after months of legal wrangling, he was facing an overwhelming list of charges, including securities fraud, wire fraud, commodities fraud, and conspiracy to commit financial crimes. The stakes were immense. If convicted, he could spend the rest of his life in prison. For months, speculation had surrounded the trial. Would Kwon plead guilty? Would he strike a deal with prosecutors? Or would he attempt to fight the charges, despite the mountain of evidence against him? When the trial began in a federal court in New York, it became clear that Kwon would not go down without a fight. Inside the packed courtroom, federal prosecutors laid out their case in painstaking detail. They presented internal Terraform Labs emails, investor testimonies, and financial records that painted a picture of a carefully orchestrated scheme. The prosecution argued that Kwon had knowingly misled investors about the stability of Terra USD. While he publicly claimed that the algorithmic stablecoin was sound, private messages showed that he had been aware of the risks for years. In one email exchange, Kwon allegedly admitted to a close associate that if investors ever lost confidence in Terra USD, the entire system would collapse within days. But instead of addressing the vulnerabilities, Kwon had doubled down on his aggressive marketing tactics, mocking critics and encouraging more people to invest in a project he knew was unstable. Prosecutors called him a financial predator who had lured in unsuspecting investors with promises of stability and high returns, only to leave them financially ruined when the system imploded. Victims of the collapse testified one after another, detailing the devastating impact of their losses. Some had lost their entire life savings. Others had taken out loans to invest in Terra USD, believing Kwon's assurances that it was the future of finance. Families were destroyed, retirements wiped out, and entire businesses forced to shut down. Kwon's defense team, however, attempted to shift the narrative. They argued that Terra USD's collapse was not fraud, but an unfortunate consequence of market forces beyond Kwon's control. They painted him as a brilliant innovator who had genuinely believed in his project, but had been blindsided by an unforeseen market downturn. The defense tried to liken the collapse to other financial crises, arguing that Kwon was no different from banking executives who had presided over economic crashes. Was he reckless? Perhaps, Kwon's lead attorney stated, but recklessness is not fraud. The trial had already captivated global audiences, but it took a dramatic turn when a former Terraform Labs executive, previously unidentified, took the stand. The executive, whose identity had been protected under a whistleblower agreement, provided damning evidence that shattered Kwon's defense. According to the whistleblower, Terraform Labs had manipulated the market to artificially maintain Terra USD's peg long before the collapse. The company allegedly engaged in secret buybacks, using undisclosed investor funds to prop up the token's value and prevent it from depegging. Kwon had reportedly orchestrated these efforts, directing his team to cover up any signs of weakness. Even more shocking, the whistleblower revealed that Kwon had personally withdrawn millions of dollars from Terraform Labs accounts in the weeks leading up to the crash. Bank records confirmed that Kwon had moved funds into offshore accounts, ensuring that he would not be financially devastated when Terra USD collapsed. The revelation sent shockwaves through the courtroom. If Kwon had truly believed in his project, why had he quietly funneled money out of the system before it failed? Faced with this new evidence, Kwon's defense team scrambled. They attempted to discredit the whistleblower, arguing that he was an embittered former employee seeking revenge. But prosecutors countered with concrete financial records, leaving little room for doubt. After months of proceedings, the jury deliberated for less than 3 days before reaching a verdict. On all major charges, securities fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy, Kwon was found guilty. When the verdict was read, Kwon showed no visible reaction. The once arrogant tech founder who had mocked his critics now sat motionless, staring at the table before him. The sentencing phase was equally dramatic. Prosecutors pushed for the harshest possible punishment, arguing that Kwon's actions had caused irreparable harm to thousands of investors. The judge, citing the severity of the case, sentenced Kwon to 40 years in federal prison, the longest sentence ever handed down for a cryptocurrency fraud case. As Kwon was led away in handcuffs, the impact of his conviction rippled through the crypto industry. For many, it was a long overdue reckoning, a sign that even in the largely unregulated world of digital finance, there were consequences for deception. Kwon's conviction sent shockwaves through the cryptocurrency market. Governments around the world used his case as justification for stricter regulations. The U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC, introduced new guidelines requiring all stablecoins to be backed by verified reserves, making algorithmic stablecoins like Terra USD virtually impossible to launch again. Meanwhile, investors who had suffered losses in the Terra collapse received some restitution. As part of Terraform Labs' legal settlement, a $2.3 billion fund was established to compensate victims. However, for many, the payments were only a fraction of what they had lost. Former Terraform Labs employees who had distanced themselves from Kwon faced their own challenges. Many found it difficult to find jobs in the crypto industry, their reputations permanently tarnished by their association with Terra USD. The collapse of Terra also marked the end of an era. The wild, unregulated growth of the crypto industry had come to a screeching halt. Once a space known for its freewheeling innovation, it was now increasingly subject to government oversight and legal scrutiny. As Quan settled into life behind bars, reports surfaced about his mental state. Once known for his arrogance and confidence, he had reportedly become withdrawn and quiet. Former colleagues who visited him described a man who had come to terms with his fate, but still refused to accept full responsibility for the collapse. In a rare prison interview conducted in 2027, Quan insisted that he had never intended to defraud anyone. "I believed in Terra," he claimed. "I truly thought it could work." But when asked about the whistleblower's testimony, the secret buybacks, the hidden withdrawals, he had no answer. The interview ended abruptly, with Quan walking away from the camera, leaving behind more questions than answers. As years passed, the story of Do Kwon became a cautionary tale taught in finance and law courses. His name became synonymous with the dangers of unchecked ambition in the cryptocurrency industry. Books and documentaries chronicled his rise and fall, painting him as both a genius and a fraud. For those who had lost everything in the Terra collapse, the trial and conviction provided some closure. But the damage had already been done. The financial scars would last a lifetime, a stark reminder that in the world of cryptocurrency, fortunes can be built and destroyed in the blink of an eye. Case 10. In the world of cybercrime, few names invoke as much fear and intrigue as Lazarus Group. An elusive and highly sophisticated hacking collective, their origins trace back to North Korea, where they are believed to operate under the guidance of the country's intelligence apparatus. Over the years, they have orchestrated some of the most devastating cyber heists in history, targeting financial institutions, cryptocurrency exchanges, and governments worldwide. Their operations are meticulous, their strategies ever-evolving, and their ability to evade law enforcement nothing short of remarkable. By 2026, Lazarus Group had cemented its reputation as the world's most dangerous cybercriminal syndicate. But it was in the summer of that year that they executed the largest crypto heist in U.S. history, sending shockwaves through the global financial system. This was not just another attack. It was a cyber onslaught that would expose the vulnerabilities of modern finance and trigger an unprecedented international manhunt. The victim was none other than VaultNet, one of the largest and most secure cryptocurrency exchanges in the United States. Headquartered in San Francisco, VaultNet had gained a reputation as the Fort Knox of digital assets, boasting cutting-edge security systems designed to protect billions of dollars in Bitcoin, Ethereum, and other cryptocurrencies. Its CEO, Michael Carter, was a former cybersecurity expert who had spent years building what he believed to be an impenetrable fortress. VaultNet used multi-layered encryption, biometric authentication, and cold storage protocols to keep funds secure. Its security team was composed of former FBI and NSA specialists, and the exchange regularly underwent rigorous third-party audits. To the outside world, VaultNet was untouchable. But Lazarus Group had other plans. In the months leading up to the heist, Lazarus hackers had quietly infiltrated VaultNet's internal systems. Their attack was not a brute force breach or a simple phishing scam. Instead, they exploited a weakness in the very technology that made VaultNet secure: its reliance on hot wallets for liquidity. Hot wallets, which are connected to the internet, allow for fast transactions, but are inherently more vulnerable to cyber attacks. Lazarus operatives planted malicious code within VaultNet's software update system, ensuring that when the exchange deployed its next security patch, the hackers would gain direct access to its transactional infrastructure. It was a silent, patient attack, months in the making. Then, on the night of July 18, 2026, they struck. The attack began with a coordinated series of unauthorized transfers, draining VaultNet's hot wallets in mere minutes. The sheer scale of the heist was staggering. By the time VaultNet's security team detected the breach, over $4.2 billion in cryptocurrency had already been funneled into thousands of anonymous wallets scattered across the blockchain. The hackers used a technique known as chain hopping, rapidly moving funds across different cryptocurrencies and blockchain networks to obscure their tracks. Within hours, the stolen assets were laundered through mixing services and decentralized exchanges, making recovery nearly impossible. VaultNet's emergency protocols kicked in, but it was too late. The company's cold storage reserves, where the majority of assets were kept, remained intact, but the damage had been done. Thousands of customers woke up to find their investments wiped out, sparking panic in the crypto markets. News of the breach spread like wildfire. Within 24 hours, Bitcoin had plummeted by 18%, Ethereum by 22%, and investor confidence in digital assets was at an all-time low. Regulators scrambled to respond, and the U.S. government declared the heist a national security threat. For federal investigators, the Lazarus attack was a digital labyrinth, a crime scene with no physical evidence, no identifiable suspects, and a money trail designed to vanish. The FBI, NSA, and Department of Justice launched Operation Shadow Trace, a task force dedicated to hunting down the stolen funds and identifying the perpetrators. Blockchain analysts worked around the clock, tracing transaction histories and monitoring darknet forums for any signs of the stolen crypto being cashed out. Within weeks, the task force uncovered a crucial clue. A portion of the stolen funds had been routed through Tornado Cash, a notorious cryptocurrency mixer previously sanctioned by the U.S. Treasury for its role in laundering illicit funds. This was a hallmark of Lazarus Group's tactics, using decentralized tools to erase financial footprints. Cybersecurity firms provided further intelligence, revealing that the malware used in the attack bore striking similarities to previous Lazarus operations, including the 2016 Bangladesh bank heist and the Ronin Bridge attack of 2022. The evidence was mounting. Lazarus Group was behind the VaultNet heist. Determined to send a message, the U.S. government took unprecedented action. President Daniel Hayes issued Executive Order 13982, authorizing the freezing of all North Korean-linked crypto assets and placing sanctions on any entity found to be aiding Lazarus Group. The Treasury Department pressured cryptocurrency exchanges worldwide to blacklist known Lazarus-affiliated wallets. Meanwhile, U.S. Cyber Command launched counteroffensive operations, targeting Lazarus Group's infrastructure. Though details remain classified, reports suggested that U.S. cyber forces disabled several North Korean servers, disrupting Lazarus operations temporarily. But Lazarus was not so easily deterred. While some stolen funds were recovered, the majority remained beyond reach, scattered across countless wallets and hidden in decentralized finance, defy protocols that defied regulation. The VaultNet heist marked a turning point in the history of cryptocurrency regulation. In the months that followed, the Crypto Transparency Act of 2027 was passed, mandating strict Know Your Customer (KYC) protocols for all blockchain-based transactions. Major exchanges implemented real-time fraud detection AI, and anonymous transactions became significantly harder to execute. For VaultNet, the damage was irreversible. Despite efforts to compensate affected customers, confidence in the platform was shattered. The exchange saw a mass exodus of users, and within a year, it filed for bankruptcy. Michael Carter, once hailed as a crypto pioneer, resigned in disgrace. But Lazarus Group remained in the shadows, undefeated and still operational. The heist had not just been about financial gain. It had been a strategic maneuver, funding North Korea's sanctioned economy and demonstrating that no financial system, no matter how fortified, was truly secure. The lesson was clear. In the digital age, money was no longer stored in vaults or bank accounts. It existed as code, vulnerable to those who knew how to break it. And Lazarus Group, the most feared cybercriminal syndicate in the world, was still watching, still waiting for its next move. The morning after the VaultNet heist, the entire financial world was in disarray. News outlets ran non-stop coverage of the attack, with bold headlines declaring it the largest digital robbery in history. Investors scrambled to withdraw their remaining funds from other exchanges, fearing they could be next. Crypto markets nosedived. Bitcoin, once seen as a beacon of financial independence, lost nearly 35% of its value in just 48 hours, wiping out billions in investor wealth. Ethereum followed, and the cascading panic spread to smaller cryptocurrencies, many of which never recovered. But the fallout wasn't just limited to the digital realm. Wall Street felt the tremors. Large investment firms that had recently entered the crypto space found their portfolios gutted. Tech companies with blockchain integrations saw their stock prices plummet. The U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC, which had long debated how to regulate the volatile industry, now faced mounting pressure to act. And at the heart of it all was VaultNet, the once mighty exchange now brought to its knees. Inside VaultNet's San Francisco headquarters, chaos reigned. Employees arrived to find law enforcement already present, seizing computers and questioning staff. Michael Carter, the embattled CEO, had barely slept. He stood in the middle of a glass-walled conference room, surrounded by his executive team and federal agents. Despite the exchange's high-level security, VaultNet had suffered a catastrophic failure. How had the attack gone unnoticed? How had their defenses been breached so effortlessly? Carter's mind raced as he replayed every decision leading up to the attack. But now none of that mattered. Customers were in uproar, lawsuits were being filed by the minute, and within hours, the FBI, SEC, and Treasury Department had launched formal investigations. Then came the final blow. VaultNet's banking partners severed ties. Without access to liquidity, the exchange was effectively dead. Carter called an emergency board meeting, but the decision was inevitable. That afternoon, VaultNet filed for bankruptcy protection, sending shockwaves across the tech industry. The company's downfall was swift. But for the thousands of customers who had lost their life savings overnight, bankruptcy was not enough. They wanted justice. As federal agencies scrambled to piece together what had happened, cybersecurity experts worked around the clock to track the stolen funds. The first step was tracing the transaction patterns. Lazarus Group had siphoned funds into thousands of newly created crypto wallets, each containing fragments of the $4.2 billion haul. Then, they bounced the funds across multiple blockchains, utilizing smart contracts and decentralized finance, DeFi protocols to obscure the trail. But the most powerful weapon in their arsenal was cryptocurrency mixers, services designed to blend illicit funds with clean assets, making transactions virtually untraceable. Despite these sophisticated obfuscation tactics, forensic blockchain analysts made a breakthrough. A single transaction, overlooked in the initial chaos, linked one of the stolen Bitcoin wallets to a North Korean server previously flagged by U.S. intelligence. It was confirmation of what authorities had long suspected. Lazarus Group was behind the attack. With this lead, federal agencies activated a network of cyber intelligence operatives, collaborating with Europol, Interpol, and private blockchain security firms. But tracking Lazarus was no easy feat. Unlike traditional criminals who left behind physical evidence, Lazarus Group existed purely in the digital realm. Their members operated from secure locations, often inside North Korea, shielded by state protection. Their tools were constantly evolving, leveraging zero-day exploits, AI-driven cyber warfare, and military-grade encryption to stay ahead of law enforcement. But the U.S. government was not about to let them escape. The White House held an emergency National Security Council meeting to address the threat. For the first time in history, a cyber attack on a financial institution was classified as an act of economic warfare. President Hayes addressed the nation, declaring, "We will pursue these criminals wherever they hide. We will not allow hostile cyber actors to undermine our economy and our national security." Behind closed doors, the Pentagon activated Operation Silent Web, a classified cyber offensive aimed at dismantling Lazarus Group's digital infrastructure. The U.S. Cyber Command, in coordination with the NSA, deployed teams of elite cyber operatives tasked with infiltrating North Korean networks. Their mission was clear: locate, disrupt, and neutralize Lazarus Group before they could strike again. But Lazarus was ready. Just as U.S. agencies began tracing stolen funds, another attack struck, this time targeting the Federal Reserve's digital payment systems. For 30 terrifying minutes, the real-time payment infrastructure of the United States was paralyzed. While no funds were stolen, the disruption sent stock markets plunging and exposed just how vulnerable even the most secure financial networks had become. The message was clear: Lazarus was not just a group of criminals. They were digital warriors, wielding cyber attacks as a weapon of economic destruction. The U.S. government now faced a dilemma. Traditional law enforcement tactics would not work against an adversary operating from behind state-sponsored protection. Any direct action against Lazarus could escalate into a geopolitical crisis with North Korea. But doing nothing was not an option. With diplomatic channels offering little recourse, the U.S. turned to its most powerful asset, the global financial system. The Treasury Department imposed the harshest sanctions ever enacted, freezing all assets linked to Lazarus Group and blacklisting any exchange, company, or nation found aiding their operations. At the same time, federal agencies launched a worldwide crackdown on crypto laundering networks. Dozens of underground money exchangers, darknet operators, and complicit businesses were arrested across Europe and Asia. But even as authorities closed in on Lazarus financial networks, the hackers remained elusive. Their leaders, known only by online aliases, communicated through encrypted channels, never revealing their real identities. And then a breakthrough. A cybersecurity analyst working for a private firm discovered a critical vulnerability in one of Lazarus Group's servers. Using this exploit, U.S. cyber operatives infiltrated the network, gathering terabytes of data, including transaction logs, malware blueprints, and most importantly, the real IP addresses of several Lazarus members. It was a goldmine of intelligence. Armed with this new information, authorities launched a global manhunt, working with South Korea, Japan, and European intelligence agencies to track down the operatives. In a series of covert operations, several Lazarus affiliates were arrested in foreign countries, leading to the first-ever criminal convictions of hackers tied to the North Korean regime. Meanwhile, the U.S. military executed targeted cyber strikes, disabling Lazarus command centers and cutting off their access to stolen funds. And yet, the core members of Lazarus Group remained at large. The stolen billions were never fully recovered, and the digital battlefield remained just as dangerous as ever. Though the VaultNet heist had finally been avenged, its impact would be felt for years to come. The world had crossed a threshold. The era of traditional financial crimes was over. Now the greatest threats were faceless, stateless, and capable of bringing down entire economies from a laptop. As the dust settled, one thing became clear. Lazarus Group may have lost this battle, but the war for the future of digital finance had only just begun. The VaultNet heist had been historic, not just for the sheer scale of the theft, but for what it represented, a paradigm shift in financial warfare. This was no longer about individual criminals skimming digital assets or rogue traders manipulating the markets. This was about something bigger. The attack had been surgical, precise, and deeply coordinated, exposing vulnerabilities that regulators, cybersecurity experts, and intelligence agencies had long feared but never truly understood. And yet, despite the arrests, the asset freezes, and the diplomatic condemnations, Lazarus Group remained elusive. As global law enforcement agencies worked to dismantle Lazarus' web of shadowy money laundering networks, something unsettling happened. The hackers themselves seemed to disappear. No more known wallet movements. No more dark web chatter. No more attacks. At first, investigators thought they had finally won, that the relentless pursuit of the past year had forced Lazarus to shut down. But the most seasoned analysts knew better. For years, Lazarus had been playing a long game, refining their tactics with each heist, each cyberattack, each scheme. This wasn't a group that simply dissolved under pressure. They had gone silent, but silence in the digital world didn't mean surrender. It meant preparation. In the weeks following the attack, U.S. intelligence intercepted classified transmissions, suggesting that Lazarus had begun restructuring its operations. Instead of relying on massive, headline-making heists, they were shifting towards smaller, more insidious tactics, deep infiltration of financial institutions, AI-driven malware, and even recruitment of insiders within major tech firms. One disturbing report suggested that some of the Lazarus operatives had been absorbed into North Korea's official cyber warfare divisions, given new identities and access to state resources. This revelation changed everything. If Lazarus had become an official arm of a government, that meant its attacks were no longer just criminal acts. They were acts of war. Determined to bring an end to Lazarus once and for all, the U.S. expanded its efforts. Cyber Command launched full-scale infiltration missions, deploying elite white hat operatives to locate, trace, and dismantle Lazarus' remaining infrastructure. It was a race against time. For every Lazarus network taken down, a new one appeared. For every compromised server shut down, another was spun up. The group's resilience was terrifying. Then came a chilling discovery. An FBI analyst working on blockchain forensics found evidence that Lazarus had begun shifting its focus to artificial intelligence and quantum-resistant cryptography, technologies that could make future financial heists completely untraceable. Lazarus wasn't just escaping justice. They were evolving. Governments around the world were now faced with a reality they had long ignored. This wasn't about a single heist or a single hacker group anymore. It was about the next era of warfare. A war fought not with missiles and tanks, but with code and cryptographic weapons. Lazarus had proven that financial institutions, even entire economies, could be destabilized with a few keystrokes. The world had stepped into an era where wealth, power, and security were no longer defined by borders, but by who controlled the flow of digital assets. The VaultNet heist would go down in history as the moment when the first shots of the cyber war were fired. But it was far from over. Somewhere, hidden behind layers of encrypted networks, Lazarus was waiting, watching, planning. Because in the world of cyber warfare, no battle was ever truly won, only delayed. Case 11. Matthew Caldwell was a name that once commanded respect in Australia's high society. Born in 1972 in Sydney, he was the kind of man who seemed to have it all: intelligence, charm, and an uncanny ability to navigate the world of finance. His career in investment banking began in the early 1990s, where he quickly climbed the corporate ladder. By the time he was in his mid-30s, Caldwell had already established his own hedge fund, Caldwell Capital, a firm that promised exclusive, high-yield investment opportunities to Australia's wealthiest individuals and institutional investors. From the outside, Caldwell appeared to be a financial genius. He was known for his lavish lifestyle, owning multi-million-dollar properties in Sydney and Melbourne, a private jet, and a collection of luxury cars. He was frequently seen at charity galas, rubbing shoulders with politicians, celebrities, and business magnates. His company boasted a proprietary trading algorithm that, according to him, could generate steady double-digit returns, even during economic downturns. But beneath the polished veneer of success lay a carefully constructed lie. Caldwell was not the financial prodigy he claimed to be. His hedge fund was nothing more than a carefully disguised Ponzi scheme, a financial house of cards that relied on the continual influx of new investor money to pay out returns to earlier investors. For nearly 2 decades, Caldwell orchestrated what would become Australia's largest financial fraud, amassing billions of dollars before his empire crumbled. In the early 2000s, Caldwell Capital was an exclusive investment firm that catered to high-net-worth individuals. Clients were drawn to the fund's promise of guaranteed returns, a phrase that should have been a red flag but was easily overlooked due to Caldwell's reputation. His firm claimed to specialize in high-frequency trading and arbitrage strategies that supposedly exploited inefficiencies in global financial markets. Caldwell had a gift for persuasion. He projected an air of confidence that made even the most skeptical investors believe in his strategy. His firm reported consistent annual returns of 18 to 22%, a figure that seemed almost too good to be true, but Caldwell always had an explanation. He told investors that his proprietary algorithm was capable of executing trades at millisecond speeds, capitalizing on market inefficiencies before anyone else. He boasted about the firm's black box technology, an ultra-secret trading strategy that no one outside his inner circle could understand or access. To add to the illusion of legitimacy, Caldwell hired some of the best talent in the finance industry, including former bank executives and quantitative analysts. He also invested heavily in marketing, ensuring that Caldwell Capital was constantly featured in financial publications and industry conferences. This created a sense of exclusivity. Only select investors were allowed into the fund, and there was always a waiting list. The more difficult it was to invest, the more desirable the opportunity became. By 2010, Caldwell had amassed more than $3.7 billion in assets under management. But in reality, there was no secret trading strategy, no sophisticated algorithm, and no real returns. The fund's profits were entirely fabricated, with old investors being paid using the deposits of new investors. It was the classic Ponzi scheme, hidden behind layers of financial jargon and a facade of exclusivity. For years, Caldwell successfully maintained the illusion. He used his investors' money to fund a lifestyle of unimaginable luxury: yachts, private islands, penthouse apartments, and extravagant vacations. He built an empire based on deceit, and as long as new money kept flowing in, the scheme remained intact. However, cracks in the foundation began to appear in 2015. Global economic uncertainty led to a slowdown in investor confidence, and suddenly, the influx of new clients dwindled. Some long-term investors, suspicious of how Caldwell was able to maintain such high returns year after year, requested withdrawals. This was a problem. Caldwell Capital did not have the liquidity to pay out investors. To keep the scheme alive, Caldwell scrambled to raise more funds. He started making increasingly desperate promises, including risk-free investment opportunities backed by non-existent assets. But this only raised suspicions among financial regulators and industry insiders. By 2017, the Australian Securities and Investments Commission, ASIC, had received numerous complaints and began investigating the fund. In 2018, an anonymous whistleblower, one of Caldwell's former employees, provided ASIC with damning evidence. Internal documents showed that Caldwell Capital had fabricated its trading records, and forensic analysis revealed that most of the firm's reported profits were fictitious. As news of the investigation broke, panic spread among investors. Many rushed to withdraw their funds, but Caldwell stalled payouts, citing temporary liquidity issues. It was only a matter of time before the entire scheme collapsed. By early 2019, Australian authorities had gathered enough evidence to charge Caldwell with multiple counts of financial fraud, securities fraud, and money laundering. In a dramatic raid, federal agents arrested him at his Sydney mansion, seizing luxury assets worth millions. The scandal dominated Australian headlines, exposing the shocking extent of his deception. What followed was one of the most high-profile financial trials in Australian history. Caldwell maintained his innocence, insisting that his trading strategy was real and that the firm was simply experiencing a temporary cash flow issue. But the evidence was overwhelming. Billions of dollars were missing, and thousands of investors had been defrauded. In 2020, Caldwell was found guilty on 17 counts of fraud and sentenced to 25 years in prison, marking the end of Australia's largest financial fraud case. The aftermath was devastating. Families lost their life savings, retirees were left penniless, and institutions that had invested with Caldwell Capital faced financial ruin. Today, the name Matthew Caldwell is synonymous with financial fraud. His story serves as a cautionary tale about blind trust in high-return investment schemes and the dangers of financial manipulation. While Australia has since implemented stricter financial regulations, the scars left by Caldwell's deception still linger in the memories of those who lost everything.